Chapter 252. A year on Earth was equivalent to 100 years on Heavenly Spiral. How long had it been since he Tiangang and the others entered the formation? How could more than a month have passed? Although he was very confused, Chun Shi quickly regained his composure. They didn't notice anything unusual. After all, when it came to time, it was obviously not a problem that ordinary cultivators could solve. Perhaps only the legendary immortal emperors would be able to see through the true meaning behind it. If that was the case, then this palace, could it be that this was an excellent place for cultivation? Just like the House of Mind in Dragon Ball. A year in the outside world was only a day inside. A cultivation place like this was close to being a bug in the system. The flow of time in different places in the universe was different. In Einstein's theory of relativity, it was believed that time and space were related. When combined together, they would form a four-dimensional spacetime coordinate and participate in the process of physical changes. A typical example could be given. For example, the greater the mass of an object, the slower the time around it would become. This was demonstrated very directly in Interstellar. Because it was close to a black hole, the male and female protagonists stayed on a planet full of water for a few hours. However, the crew members on the spaceship had already stayed on the spaceship for 23 years. When the male and female protagonists returned to the spaceship and met the crew members again, the crew members had already become white-haired old men. The reason why the flow of time on Heavenly Spiral was different from that of Earth was obviously because the mass of Heavenly Spiral was much greater than that of Earth. However, this palace was on Earth, so what was the reason for the flow of time in this palace to be different from that of the outside world? Chun Shi was only at the soul formation stage. He hadn't even comprehended the void. Naturally, it was impossible for him to comprehend the true meaning of time. Therefore, after frowning and thinking for a while, he decisively threw this inexplicable phenomenon to the back of his mind. The most important thing now was to find a way to leave this palace. As for the rest, he would think about it later. Thinking of this, Chun Shi couldn't help but look up at the dome. There were circles of strange patterns on the dome. It was as if a large net was hanging in the sky. He looked down at his feet. The floor of the palace looked dark and shiny. The material seemed to be obsidian. The floor was not flat because there were many protruding lines on it. They looked similar to the lines on the dome. In the large hall, the white dome and black floor actually presented a different kind of beauty due to the similarity of the veined patterns. Apart from the giant stone pillar that supported the dome, there was nothing else in the hall. Chun Shi circled the stone pillar but didn't find anything out of the ordinary. So, in front of everyone's surprised eyes, he jumped up and flew directly to the dome. Seeing this, He Tiangang couldn't help but smile. He clenched his fists and shouted excitedly, "We're saved!" Hearing this, the Wu Lian people were all overjoyed. The person in front of him was a legendary celestial. He must have a way to get them out of this damned place. Li Taidan and Xue Shuzhen had been by Chun Shi's side for a few days now. When they saw Chun Shi suddenly reveal such an inhuman side, they were shocked. Their eyes were wide open and they couldn't say a word. Mr. Chun could fly? Could he be Superman? The people below were very excited. But after Chun Shi flew to the dome, he couldn't help but frown. There was no light source in the hall, but it was still as bright as day. There wasn't even a shadow. Standing in the hall was like standing under a shadowless lamp. There wasn't even a shadow to be seen. The light source seemed to be on the dome. Chun Shi took a closer look and found that the material of the dome was somewhat like stone, but it had a faint metallic luster. It looked similar to the stone tablet at the entrance that was engraved with the words warding off evil and sealing demons. Chun Shi reached out his right hand and was about to touch the dome. However, the moment his palm touched the dome, the originally solemn hall suddenly shook violently. Chun Shi was shocked and quickly retreated a few meters. Then he realized that the movement was coming from the stone pillar that supported the dome. The stone pillar kept shaking, and a strong force seemed to be breaking out of it. Seeing this, Chun Shi immediately shouted to the people below, "Be careful!" Just as he finished speaking, like a fragmented grenade exploding in the hall, the giant stone pillar that supported the dome suddenly broke apart and turned into countless pieces that shot out in all directions. Chun Shi's figure suddenly disappeared in the air. When he reappeared, he was already in front of He Tiangang and the others. He held the sword with both hands and placed the Tianyan sword in front of his chest. A light shield suddenly rose and protected He Tiangang and the others. The giant stone pillar was at least 10 meters in diameter. Now that it suddenly exploded, thousands of pieces shot out in all directions in the hall, and there was a continuous crackling sound. If Chun Shi wasn't here, He Tiangang and the others would have been turned into a sieve by the flying pieces of stone, and there wouldn't even be a corpse left. The explosion soon subsided, and the pieces of the stone pillar were spread all over the floor. After Chun Shi removed the light shield, He Tiangang and the others carefully began to look around. The explosion just now was very fierce, but there wasn't even a scratch on the walls of the hall. From this, it could be seen how sturdy the hall was. The giant stone pillar that supported the dome turned into rubble, and at this moment, a pillar of light suddenly shot down from the dome. The pillar of light replaced the original stone pillar. Seeing this, Chun Shi suddenly stabbed the Tianyan sword into the ground. A light shield rose again, enveloping He Tiangang and the others. "All of you stay here. Don't move." After instructing everyone, Chun Shi walked out of the light shield. Like sunlight peeking through the gaps in the clouds, the pillar of light was golden, and it faintly emitted a strong pressure. The pillar of light grew brighter and brighter. Everyone quickly averted their gazes. There was no way they could open their eyes in such a strong light. At this moment, Chun Shi sharply noticed that a black shadow had appeared in the strong light. Roar! Following an earth-shattering roar, a snake-like thing suddenly pounced out of the pillar of light, heading straight for Chun Shi. Seeing this, Chun Shi immediately grasped the air, and a new celestial sword Dharma appeared in his hand. As soon as the celestial sword Dharma was formed, Chun Shi held the long sword in his hand and directly slashed at the black shadow. A sword hidden in the air. The green sword radiance suddenly burst out. Like a long river hanging upside down, it swept up surging true core energy and rushed into the sky, straight into the clouds. Roar! The black shadow let out a loud roar, and then collided with the sword radiance. Invisible energy waves exploded from the center of the collision, and instantly set off a strong wind storm in the hall. At this moment, Chun Shi saw the black shadow clearly. It was actually a dragon. It wasn't a winged four-legged lizard in Western myths and legends, but a divine dragon that represented Wuxia's spiritual culture. A creature that only existed in myths and legends had now appeared in front of Chun Shi's eyes. Chapter 253. Ere your wings said. The dragon is the head of the scaled insect. It has 9 shapes. The head is like a camel, the horns are like a deer, the eyes are like a rabbit, the ears are like a cow, the neck is like a snake, the belly is like a snake, the scales are like a carp, the claws are like an eagle, the palms are like a tiger. There are 81 scales on its back, and it has the number of 99 suns. Its voice is like a copper plate. There is a beard beside its mouth, a pearl under its chin, and a reverse scale under its throat. There is a mountain on its head, also known as the ruler of wood. The dragon cannot fly without a ruler of wood. It can form clouds with its breath, and it can change into water and fire. But what is strange is that the appearance of this dragon is still somewhat different from the legendary 5-clawed golden dragon. The 5-clawed golden dragon is obviously golden, but the dragon in front of Chun Shi is dark green. Or, this is an azure dragon? This azure dragon's body is about 30 meters long, and it seems to be bigger than the giant python in the Berserk python disaster. It arches its body and floats in the air, and the dark green scales are at least the size of a palm. Looking carefully, the scales seem to be shining with an indescribable luster, which can be called flowing light and colorful. Dragons are a symbol of auspiciousness, but its appearance is definitely not cute, and it even looks a little ferocious. When this azure dragon stares at Chun Shi with its golden vertical pupils, its eyes suddenly become like a human's, suddenly with a bit of fierceness. In this regard, Chun Shi did not have much reaction, but the group of people behind him were frightened. Among them, A few of the less resolute ones were so frightened that they fell to the ground. This is a living dragon. After the azure dragon flew out of the light pillar, it immediately roared at Chun-Shi. The hidden dragon has fallen asleep, and its roar moves thousands of mountains. Seeing that the azure dragon was about to pounce, Chun-Shi raised his hand and slashed. However, this azure dragon did not dodge. When the sword hit its body, it was immediately like a water arrow hitting its body, and was immediately scattered by the dragon scales. The azure dragon did not seem to expect that this little bug would dare to provoke its majesty, so it immediately roared. Following that, it danced in the air and pounced on Chun-Shi, who was on the ground. It waved its gigantic body and slammed down like a giant wave. Seeing this, Chun-Shi couldn't help but frown. Could it be? Was he going to slay a dragon today? Seeing this azure dragon charging over menacingly, Chun-Shi naturally could not sit still and wait for death. No matter what it was, he would beat it into submission first. Thus, Chun-Shi immediately held the Tianyan sword in front of his chest. The tip of the sword suddenly shone brightly, releasing a burst of golden light. It was as bright as the sun, instantly illuminating the entire palace. Condense the will as the spirit, and the spirit as the sword. The 8 extremities boundless expanse was the so-called Earth Sword. 49 forms of heavenly divination, sword technique chapter. He Tiangang and the others hid behind the shield that Chun-Shi had set up for them. When they saw what was happening in front of them, they couldn't help but cry out in alarm. After Chun-Shi slashed out with his sword, a burst of golden light shone brightly. The blinding light made it impossible for them to look directly at it, so they could only cover their eyes in pain. There was no word that could describe the sharpness of this sword. It was as if it could split the heavens and earth in half. Chun-Shi stood proudly with his sword in hand. The azure dragon's figure was no longer in his eyes, only a golden sword light that pierced through the heavens and earth. Then, the blue wave and the golden light collided violently. Roar! Following the azure dragon's roar, the entire palace began to shake violently. The stone pillars that were scattered all over the ground were now completely turned into fine powder under the impact of wave after wave of force. They were reduced to dust that could not even be seen by the naked eye. One move of the human sword was enough to wipe out a mountain, not to mention that Chun-Shi had just used the earth sword. But strangely, in the face of such a powerful impact, although the palace was shaking violently, the surrounding walls were not damaged at all. Not even a small crack appeared. When the golden light dissipated, other than the huge stone pillar that supported the dome, only a thick layer of dust was left on the obsidian floor. Everything seemed to be as good as new. As for the azure dragon, it was actually not affected at all. The azure dragon's speed was very fast. As soon as Chun-Shi slashed out with the earth sword, it had already arrived in front of Chun-Shi. Chun-Shi didn't even have time to slash out a second time before the azure dragon bared its fangs and claws and bit towards Chun-Shi. Seeing this, Chun-Shi's body suddenly glowed with golden light. He used his true chi to form a shield and prepared to take the azure dragon's attack head-on. But at this time, the azure dragon's figure directly passed through his body. Chun-Shi was stunned, because at this time he realized that the azure dragon was not real. It was just an illusion. No, it's wrong to call it an illusion because it clearly received his attack just now. Chun-Shi raised his eyebrows and was about to turn around and slash again. But at this time, the azure dragon had already passed through the shield he set up for He Tiangang and crashed into He Tiangong's body. Although He Tiangang was a great master in the Alcade state, but to be honest, the Alcade state was only equivalent to a cultivator in the chi refining stage. A battle of this level was obviously beyond He Tiangong's understanding. Therefore, He Tiangong's mind was blank. He didn't even have time to react. He could only watch as the 30-meter-long azure dragon drilled into his body. Yes, the azure dragon drilled into his body. The azure dragon's speed was very fast. In the blink of an eye, it had completely entered He Tiangong's body. Because this scene was so shocking, He Tiangang couldn't come back to his senses at all. Until the azure dragon's figure disappeared from the hall and completely entered his body, He Tiangang still had a blank expression on his face. He Tiangang raised his hand and wanted to touch his chest. But at this time, a painful expression suddenly flashed across his face, and then he suddenly closed his eyes. Soon, He Tiangang opened his eyes again. But when he opened his eyes again, He Tiangong's eyes had turned into a pair of golden vertical pupils. They looked like the eyes of the azure dragon just now. At first glance, it was obvious that they were not eyes that a normal human could have. "How dare you, evil creature!" Seeing this scene, she couldn't help but fly into a rage, because he finally understood. He had been fooled. No wonder the stone tablet at the entrance of the formation was engraved with the words, "Seal evil and repel demons." Could it be that the formation was suppressing this azure dragon? But this azure dragon was clearly just a remnant soul. It was only because his divine soul was damaged that she didn't notice the abnormality at first. Looking at He Tiangong's current appearance, it was obvious that this azure dragon had taken over his body. Seeing this, she immediately let go of the long sword, and then suddenly clasped his hands in front of his chest. Since this azure dragon was just a remnant soul, he would destroy its divine soul today. 49 Styles of Heavenly Divination, Spell Section. Chapter 254. Possession. When she saw what was happening to He Tiangang, he immediately flew into a rage. After letting out an angry grunt, she suddenly clasped his hands together in front of his chest. Then he slowly pulled his palms apart. A golden light suddenly appeared between Shi's palms. As he slowly pulled his palms apart, the golden light became brighter and brighter. In the end, it was as if she was holding the sun in his hands. The dazzling light that seeped through the gaps between his fingers was so blinding that it was impossible to look at it directly. The golden light in Shi's hands grew even brighter. But in the eyes of the Wu Lian people. But they didn't see anything. This was because Evil Vanquisher was an attack on the soul. They were not immortal cultivators, so they naturally could not sense the fluctuations in the surrounding spiritual energy. However, although the others could not see it, the azure dragon in front of them clearly knew what was good for it. He Tiangang could be considered to have 8 lifetimes of bad luck. This azure dragon had probably been suppressed for too long, so as soon as it was released, it wanted to find a body to possess. It was not that the azure dragon was not interested in Shi, but the strength that Shi displayed just now was too strong. The azure dragon did not have absolute confidence, so it could only settle for the next best thing. Among everyone present, apart from Shi, He Tiangong's cultivation level was the highest. Naturally, he became the azure dragon's first target for possession. Because the difference in cultivation level between the two was too great, the azure dragon immediately seized control of He Tiangong's body as soon as it entered. After He Tiangong's body was possessed, his eyeballs immediately underwent a huge change. The pair of golden vertical pupils that originally belonged to the azure dragon appeared in He Tiangong's eye sockets, giving off a very strange feeling. Upon closer inspection, this pair of eyes that did not belong to a human seemed to faintly shine with an indescribable cold light. At this moment, she suddenly flipped his palm and pushed forward. The white sun flame immediately released a boundless pressure. It was like a spear filled with killing intent, and it instantly blasted towards He Tiangang. Seeing this, He Tiangong's eyes couldn't help but tremble. The vertical pupils in his eye sockets strangely shrank, completely turning into fine lines. But then, his pupils suddenly widened, and there were 2 balls of red flames that kept pulsating in them. Then, He Tiangang opened his mouth and let out a roar at Shi that did not sound like a human at all. Roar! Following the roar, the 2 flames suddenly turned into 2 crimson dragons. A mighty fire tornado suddenly gushed out from He Tiangong's eyes, sweeping towards Shi. The golden light and the crimson flame collided violently. In an instant, like a cannonball hitting an armory, a shocking explosion occurred in the hall. The air seemed to be ignited by the raging flames, and the raging flames filled the entire space. However, this was a battle on the level of the spirit, so to outsiders it was as if nothing had happened. Shi's spirit was damaged and could not directly use divine telekinesis to fight. But after such a long time of accumulation, his cultivation had mostly recovered, so the power of Evil Vanquisher was naturally far greater than before. However, what Qianxi did not expect was that his Evil Vanquisher, which he had used all his strength to unleash, was still blocked by the flames spewing out from He Tiangong's eyes. It was obvious how strong the remnant soul of this azure dragon was. Although Wu Lian and the others couldn't see what Qianxi and He Tiangang were doing, a battle of spirits of this level, just the spiritual storm created by the collision was enough to give them a splitting headache. Naturally, they couldn't pay attention to what was happening around them. Iron Egg Li and Xue Shuzhen were professional soldiers with strong willpower, but even so, they bitterly held on for about 5 seconds before their eyes rolled back and they completely fainted. If even they were in such a state, there was no need to mention an ordinary person like Professor He, who had no foundation in cultivation. Seeing their companions collapse one after another, the remaining neutralizing grandmasters gritted their teeth and held on for about 10 seconds before collapsing to the ground one after another. Only 2 people remained standing in the hall. In contrast to Qianxi's calm and collected appearance, He Tiangong's condition was clearly much worse. Not only was his face pale, but his forehead was also covered in sweat. His tired appearance made him look like an athlete who had just finished a round of a marathon. After all, the Azure Dragon had just successfully taken over this body. This level of exhaustion was naturally a bit too much for it to bear. So when it saw Qianxi acting as if nothing had happened, the Azure Dragon's heart immediately trembled. Couldn't help but use He Tiangong's body to speak. "You are very strong. Have no grudge with you. Let me leave. I will remember your kindness." His accent was very strange. He sounded like a foreigner. It was just a short sentence, but it took a lot of effort to speak. Obviously, the Azure Dragon hadn't gotten used to this body yet and couldn't control it skillfully. Hearing this, Qianxi looked at him deeply, then replied with a serious face, "I can let you go, but the premise is, you have to leave his body." No. Hearing that Qianxi wanted it to leave He Tiangong's body, the Azure Dragon immediately replied, "Without a body, I can't leave here." "Okay, then there's nothing to talk about." Qianxi shrugged indifferently, then said with a regretful expression, "I brought him here. You took over his body right in front of me, and now you want to leave safely like nothing happened? Let me tell you, there's no such thing as a cheap deal in this world." After hearing Qianxi's words, He Tiangong's expression immediately became uncertain, as if he was thinking. But Qianxi didn't intend to give him too much time to think. Although He Tiangong's body was occupied by the Azure Dragon, his consciousness obviously couldn't be swallowed by the Azure Dragon so quickly. So as long as the Azure Dragon's remnant soul was driven out of He Tiangong's body, then He Tiangang could still be saved. If time dragged on and the Azure Dragon completely merged with this body, even a golden immortal couldn't do anything. Seeing that the Azure Dragon still didn't answer, Qianxi decisively spread out his hands, and 2 dazzling lights lit up in his palms again. Since Evil Punisher couldn't destroy it, then he could try another move. Anyway, he had plenty of tricks up his sleeves. Seeing that Qianxi seemed to want to fight again, the Azure Dragon immediately cowered, so it quickly said, "Wait, I have an idea." Hearing this, Qianxi immediately retracted his hands and asked, "What idea? You help me open the channel. After the channel is open, I'll come out from his body. Then you cover me and leave." "Okay." Qianxi pondered for a moment, so he readily agreed to the Azure Dragon's request. There was no exit in this hall, and the 4 walls were incomparably hard. Presumably, only the Azure Dragon knew how to get out. Since that was the case, there was no harm in cooperating. He helped the Azure Dragon escape, and the Azure Dragon left He Tiangong's body. Chapter 255. The man and the dragon quickly reached a consensus. After that, Qianxi learned the way to leave the hall from He Tiangang. The hall was like a sealed jar, and the only way out was above the dome. In the center of the dome, where the light beam came from, there was a crystal-like thing. As long as Qianxi flew up and took the crystal, they could leave this place. It sounded very simple, so Qianxi flew directly to the dome according to what the Azure Dragon said, and found a crystal in the center of the dome. It was a hexagonal rhombus-shaped crystal, and its size was about the same as the crystal trophy used in award ceremonies. Qianxi tried to dig at the crystal with his hand, but to his surprise, the crystal was easily removed. The moment Qianxi removed the crystal, it was as if there was a huge earthquake outside, causing the entire hall to shake violently. Qianxi looked down and found that several cracks suddenly appeared on the walls around the hall. It was not right to call them cracks because these cracks were very neat, as if they could have been separated. Under Qianxi's slightly surprised gaze, the hall bloomed like a lotus in summer. The ground turned into a lotus pod, the walls turned into petals, and bloomed in front of Qianxi. The arc-shaped walls fell out one by one at a very fast speed, but they did not make any sound when they fell. The wind and snow that filled the sky suddenly came. Qianxi looked up and found that he was now in an observatory, and the spirit fog that covered the sky and the moon had disappeared. Everything happened very quickly. The moment the cracks appeared on the walls of the hall, He Tiangang suddenly showed a look of ecstasy. Almost without any hesitation, just as the wall cracked to reveal a gap big enough for an adult to leave, the Azure Dragon controlled He Tiangong's body and jumped out of the hall. Run! As for the agreement between it and Qianxi, it was originally the Azure Dragon's stalling tactic. In fact, the Azure Dragon had never thought of leaving He Tiangong's body. After all, the heaven-defying act of seizing another's body was not without restrictions. This time, in order to seize He Tiangong's body, the Azure Dragon had already paid a great price. Therefore, Qianxi wanted it to obediently leave He Tiangong's body and look for a new body to seize. In the Azure Dragon's eyes, this was simply wishful thinking. With only a strand of remnant soul left, it could be said to be a rootless duckweed. Now that it had finally found a place to stay, the Azure Dragon naturally would not give up so easily. Although this body was still too weak at the moment, as long as it was given enough time, the Azure Dragon was confident that it could transform it into its original body. The little abacus in Azure Dragon's heart rang loudly, but it missed the most important point. That was, it did not have a correct understanding of Qianxi's cultivation. Therefore, as soon as He Tiangang moved, Qianxi, who was flying in the air, lowered his head and looked at He Tiangang's fleeing figure. There's a path to heaven, but you don't want to take it. There's no door to hell, but you insist on barging in. Since you're going back on your word, don't blame me for being merciless. Qianxi spread out his hands, and the vital essence in his body surged. Immediately, 2 balls of light appeared in his palms. Then, Qianxi held the 2 balls of light and quickly gestured in front of his chest. Suddenly, he slammed his palms toward He Tiangang's back. 49 Forms of Heavenly Divination Soul Dao Chapter. Tai Suppression, 3 Qis as 1. Soul Catcher. Soul Catcher was slightly different from Evil Vanquisher, because Soul Catcher was a pure spiritual attack. Qianxi's spiritual injury was very serious, so the moment he forcefully used Soul Catcher, his face flushed red. This move could be said to hurt the enemy 1,000 times, but hurt himself 800 times. However, the Azure Dragon had gone back on its word first, so today, Qianxi was determined to destroy its soul. No matter what kind of position it had in Chinese culture, in short, today, the proud dragon has no regrets. Perhaps sensing the pressure coming from behind, He Tiangang stepped on the snow and quickly leaped out. At the same time, he did not forget to look back. When he saw the golden light in Qianxi's hands, He Tiangang suddenly stopped. Then, he turned toward Qianxi and let out a resounding dragon roar. Roar! The roar of a tiger and the roar of a dragon was mighty and continuous. The Azure Dragon probably knew that today's matter could not be settled peacefully. Therefore, after this deep roar sounded from afar, the shadow of an Azure Dragon suddenly appeared behind He Tiangang. The hidden dragon sleeps, and its roar shakes thousands of mountains. The shadow of the Azure Dragon coiled in the air. At the same time that Qianxi slammed his palms, the shadow of the Azure Dragon soared into the air with a monstrous force. Like a giant python pouncing on its prey, it opened its bloody mouth and rushed toward Qianxi. At this moment, Chun, she seemed to see the shadow of great-granduncle in it. It was a very familiar scene, but Chun, she did not have time to think about it, because the soul catcher had been released. Like a descendant shooting down the sun, 2 light arrows shot out from Chen Shi's hands, directly toward the shadow of the azure dragon that was pouncing toward him. And at the moment when the light arrows and the shadow of the azure dragon collided in the air, the whole scene between heaven and earth seemed to be frozen. Snow fluttered in the snowy mountains. Under the sparse moonlight, the wind and snow filled the sky. The light arrows shot in from the dragon's head. After a flash, they pierced through the entire shadow of the azure dragon and directly entered He Tiangang's body. The resounding dragon roar sounded again, but this time it did not come from He Tiangang's mouth. Instead, it came from the shadow of the azure dragon. As if it had suffered a huge injury, the shadow of the azure dragon trembled violently. Then, it curled up into a circle in the air, raised its head and roared angrily toward the sky. Formless sound waves continuously sounded from the mouth of the azure dragon. Circle after circle, they spread in all directions. At the same time, He Tiangang, who was on the ground, stared with his slightly ferocious golden vertical pupils. There was a trace of disbelief on his face. However, the surprise on his face did not last long. After a few breaths of time, He Tiangang suddenly closed his eyes under the expressionless gaze of Chun Shi, and then fell into the thick snow. At this time, the shadow of the azure dragon in the air, like a group of disturbed fireflies, suddenly turned into specks of starlight and disappeared in the wind and snow. The soul was destroyed. This azure dragon that only existed in myths and legends was mercilessly obliterated by Chun Shi. Everything returned to silence. Only the sound of the wind was left between heaven and earth. After looking at the diamond-shaped crystal in his hand thoughtfully, Chun Shi looked down at the hall below. Chapter 256. Chun Shi flew in the air and looked down at the scenery below. The thick spirit fog had dissipated, so his field of vision was wide open. After carefully observing his surroundings, Chun Shi found that he was now on a snowy mountain not far from the Siala mountain pass. In other words, although the formation entrance was in the oasis, the formation core was the unknown snowy mountain next to it. The walls around the hall were not closed, like an open-air camp. The dark ground was in stark contrast to the surrounding white snow. The wind and snow were too strong, and the temperature was at least minus 60 degrees Celsius. Therefore, in just a few minutes, Wu Lian and the others lying on the ground were covered with a thin layer of snow. Chun Shi estimated that they would not wake up for a while, so he moved the survivors to the temporary laboratory in the oasis. After settling the group of people, Chun Shi flew back to the spacious hall and began to carefully study the rhombus-shaped crystal in his hand. This rhombus-shaped crystal was transparent, and a faint purple mist constantly rose in the middle. Chun Shi held his breath and silently felt the cold feeling coming from the crystal. But after studying it for a while, he still could not detect any signs of energy fluctuations from it. It was as if it was just an ordinary piece of natural crystal. But that was obviously impossible. If the hall was the cage that imprisoned the azure dragon, then this crystal was obviously the key. It was just that Chun Shi did not know how to use this key. The flow of time in the hall was different from the outside world, so this kind of cultivation place was undoubtedly very attractive to the current Chun Shi. If he had the key to the hall, then he could come here to cultivate when he had nothing to do. A cultivation place comparable to Tianxian. How could Chun Shi not be tempted? Thinking of this, Chun Shi could not help but show a trace of annoyance on his face. If he had known, he would not have hit so hard. The azure dragon didn't keep its word. Chun Shi was worried that He Tiangong's soul would be devoured by the azure dragon if it dragged on. So he decisively killed him. Now that he thought about it, it was quite a pity. The main hall was obviously a cage used to suppress the azure dragon. Although they did not know how long it had been imprisoned here, judging from the azure dragon's behavior just now, it clearly had a certain degree of understanding of this main hall. However, it was too late to say anything now. He had already killed the azure dragon, so Chun Shi could only slowly explore the secrets of the hall. After pondering for a while, She began pouring his true essence into the crystal. When the true essence flowed into the crystal, the dense purple qi in the crystal began to surge. There's hope. Seeing this, she couldn't help but raise his eyebrows. He began to madly pour his qi into the crystal. The surging true essence continued to flow into the crystal, and the dense purple qi inside immediately began to revolve. As the dense purple gas spun faster and faster, a faint purple vortex gradually formed in the crystal like a glass of water being shaken. After that, she held the crystal and looked at the main hall expectantly. However, he waited for a while, but there was no movement in the main hall. Is it scrapped? She frowned and muttered to himself. Only then did he fly into the main hall and look at the surroundings with some regret. Before the main hall was unsealed, it was like a flower bud that had not bloomed. After she plucked the crystal, the lotus began to bloom. With the base of the main hall as the center, the walls fell back one by one and split into 16 petals. The shape of each side was quite similar to the petals of the lotus. This shape, it did not look like the 9 lotus seats under the gods. She came to one of the walls and began to touch and knock on it, trying to find some useful clues. However, after studying for a while, he did not find anything strange, so he had to give up helplessly. This main hall was probably the same as the formation, which was a one-time use, so there was no way to restore it after it was activated. What a pity! She flew to the top of the main hall against the wind and snow. After reluctantly looking back at the black lotus blooming on the top of the snow mountain, he was about to leave with some regret. However, at the moment he turned around, she suddenly remembered a sentence that the Azure Dragon once said. Without a body, I can't leave here. Without a body, there was no way to leave here. Once this place was opened, the wind would blow on all sides. How could he not get out? Thinking of this, she could not help but raise his eyebrows. He immediately turned around and flew into the main hall. Then, he sat cross-legged on the obsidian floor. After setting up a defensive formation, he began to try to let his soul out of his body. Soul out of the body. For Shi, whose soul had been damaged, this was actually a very dangerous thing to do. If he was not careful, his soul might be destroyed, leaving only an empty shell without a soul. It was difficult for Shi to even use his divine sense, let alone his soul out of his body. Therefore, just as he was about to leave his body, he immediately suffered a backlash. His face could not help but turn pale. Shi had no choice but to temporarily stop this dangerous behavior, and then silently adjust his breathing. Danger always accompanied opportunity. This cultivation place was extremely tempting to Shi, so he did not want to give it up. Therefore, after a simple adjustment, Shi began to try again. Bit by bit, he let his soul out of his body. The shape of the soul was not fixed. Although the Azure Dragon had been imprisoned for a long time, its soul had always maintained the appearance of its original body. From this, one could see the strength of the Azure Dragon's soul. Because Shi's soul was damaged, his soul looked like a weak flame. It was so weak that it could be extinguished by the wind at any time. When the flame flew out from between Shi's eyebrows, Shi entered a mysterious state. He didn't need eyes or ears, but he could clearly see everything around him. Even how a snowflake fell from the sky and how many times it spun in the air. Shi was very clear. This was the so-called divine sense. It was a type of perception that transcended the 5 senses. It was like a radar, and even the rustling of grass in the wind could not escape his divine sense. After his soul left his body, Shi, who had turned into a flame, carefully approached the edge of the hall. And just as Shi's soul was about to float out of the hall, a bright light suddenly appeared in front of him. Sure enough, although the hall was still in the shape of a lotus platform, when Shi's soul approached the edge of the lotus platform, circles of strange light patterns immediately appeared around him. Looking carefully, the light patterns were exactly the same as the patterns carved on the dome. Looking at the ground, the protruding lines on the obsidian floor were also strangely glowing at this moment. In an instant, the sky and the ground were full of light patterns. Like 2 large nets, She was firmly trapped in the center of the hall. Inescapable net. Chapter 257. Looking at the strange light patterns that covered the sky in front of him, she was not surprised, but happy. Through the perception of his divine sense, he had already keenly noticed that the diamond-shaped crystal in his hand had a new change. The dense purple gas in the middle of the crystal was originally in the shape of a whirlpool. But when Qi's divine sense floated to the edge of the hall, the whirlpool immediately turned into the shape of a lotus, and the shape looked somewhat similar to the current appearance of the hall. Seeing this, Shi immediately returned his divine sense to his body, ending this dangerous action. After his divine sense returned to his body, Shi was still sitting cross-legged on the ground. After silently adjusting for a while, he finally opened his eyes. Forcing his divine sense to leave his body was still too much for the current Shi. Therefore, after just a few minutes, his face became very pale, and he looked like a patient who had just recovered from a serious illness. However, although his face was ugly, Shi could not help but smile, because he discovered a secret, and that was, this seemingly ordinary crystal was actually the legendary soul crystal. The so-called soul crystal was actually a strange crystal that could host the divine sense. This kind of crystal was also very rare in the Tianyuan world. The soul crystal was very precious. On one hand, it was extremely rare, and on the other hand, it was a necessary material to refine divine sense attack-type magic treasures. In addition to being able to refine magic treasures, the soul crystal, as a kind of spiritual treasure, had the effect of warming and nourishing the divine sense. With the environment on Earth, it was obviously impossible to breed a magical medicine that could heal divine sense injuries. Therefore, this soul crystal was definitely a life-saving straw for Shi, whose divine sense was injured. No wonder this hall could imprison the Azure Dragon's divine sense. It was obviously because of this soul crystal. Thinking of this, she had a rough understanding of the mechanism of the hall's operation. Using the soul crystal as the eye of the formation to imprison the Azure Dragon, who was only left with his divine sense. And the reason why Tiangang and the others had not triggered any mechanism after being trapped for more than a month was, they were not immortal cultivators, so they did not have enough pure true essence to trigger the mechanism. Therefore, this array formation and the main hall were obviously set up by immortal cultivators. Moreover, this unknown immortal cultivator was at least at the insightful emptiness realm. Otherwise, it would be impossible for him to set up such a grand formation that involved the true meaning of the word void. With the soul crystal as the core of the formation, if not for his appearance and triggering the mechanism in the hall, the Azure Dragon who had lost his physical body would never have been able to escape the seal. There are also immortal cultivators on Earth? Thinking of this, she suddenly frowned. It was said that the proud dragon had no regrets, but now he was a little regretful. He should have left Azure Dragon alive to interrogate him. But what was done, and there was no point in regretting it now. Therefore, she could only put this question aside for the time being. Then he closed his eyes and concentrated, trying to let his spirit enter the soul crystal. The soul fire once again flew out from between Shi's eyebrows, and then directly flew into the diamond-shaped crystal in his hand. After Shi's spirit flew into the soul crystal, a feeling as warm as the sun in March immediately enveloped his spirit. It was a very wonderful experience, and it made Shi feel very comfortable. His injured spirit could only sense things within a radius of 10 meters, but after his spirit entered the soul crystal, the range of Shi's divine sense suddenly expanded and covered the entire mountain in an instant. In an instant, with the crystal as the center, she could sense every movement in the wind and grass. This feeling, he had not experienced it for a long time. Nourishing the spirit was an additional effect of the soul crystal. Naturally, it would not be as fast as the magic medicine, and it would take a long time. Therefore, at this time, she could not help but think of the main hall. As soon as he thought of this, a series of rumbling sounds suddenly came from the hall. Following that, the 16 walls began to slowly rise up and gradually close together. The main hall changed back to its original appearance. The soul crystal, which was the core of the array, could still control the main hall. Seeing this, She could not help but feel happy. He immediately counted silently in his heart. He wanted to calculate the difference between the flow of time in the main hall and the outside world. She enjoyed the nourishment of the soul crystal as he counted seriously. When he counted to 10,000, she thought of something again. The main hall was suddenly like a remote-controlled toy, and it slowly bloomed with a rumbling sound. Each number was exactly 1 second. In other words, he stayed in the main hall for about 166 minutes. Before the main hall was fully opened, She excitedly flew out of the main hall and rushed directly in the direction of the temporary laboratory. When he brought everyone back to the laboratory, it was about 1:30 in the morning. He counted 10,000 seconds in the main hall. 166 minutes, which was 7 hours. According to the flow of time that Tiangang said, if the main hall did not lose its effect, then only about 2 minutes had passed in the outside world. The more She thought about it, the more excited he became. He quickly rushed back to the oasis from the top of the mountain. There was a quartz clock in the temporary laboratory. The answer he wanted was there. The wind and snow were still in the sky. Thick dark clouds blocked the moonlight, so the surroundings were pitch black. After nervously opening the storm door of the laboratory, she saw Tiangang and the others, who were still unconscious. In the dim laboratory, only one energy-saving lamp was still on. Next to the energy-saving lamp was the quartz clock that Professor he had brought. She walked to the table and looked down at the time on the table. He was stunned. The time on the quartz clock indicated that it was 1:55 in the morning. When he left, the time should be around 1:34 in the morning. Putting aside some errors, it should be around 20 minutes. However, he stayed in the main hall for a full 10,000 seconds. In other words, the ratio of the flow of time between the main hall and the outside world should be about 8 times. It was not as exaggerated as 100. However, even if it was only 8 times the time difference, it was more than enough for Shi. 1 day in the outside world was 8 days in the main hall. What kind of concept was that? Shi thought about it for a while. However, he vaguely felt that something was wrong. According to what Tiangang said, they had been trapped in the hall for more than a month. Why was it that the time difference between the hall and the outside world was only 8 times that of the outside world? A month in the main hall should be at least 4 days in the outside world. Shi thought about it for a long time but could not figure it out. In the end, he could only put this question to the back of his mind. He planned to confirm it after Tiangang woke up. In short, it did not matter if it was 8 times or 100 times. This time, he had really found a treasure. After confirming the use of the main hall and the soul crystal, Shi immediately set up a restriction in the temporary laboratory. As soon as someone woke up, he would know immediately. After that, Shi plunged into the main hall and began to use the soul crystal to heal the injuries to his soul. Because his soul was out of his body, he could not cultivate. Therefore, in his boredom, he could not help but let his imagination run wild. Starting tomorrow, after Nian fell asleep, he could secretly bring Ying here. Then, they could cultivate together as husband and wife and... Chapter 258. Morning, 6:27 a.m. When Shi sensed that someone had woken up in the laboratory through the restriction, he stopped cultivating for the night. Although only 4 hours had passed in the outside world, he had stayed in the hall for a full day and a half. Time and space were concepts that were both independent and interconnected. This was not the heavenly jade realm, but Earth. Other people only had 24 hours a day on Earth, and Shi was also on Earth. However, he could extend his day to nearly 200 hours through the hall. What did 200 hours mean? It was enough to turn a newbie who didn't even know how to loot a bag into a sly old fox who lay in the bushes and waited patiently for a delivery. This kind of miraculous effect that could be called a miracle naturally moved Shi, who had never been moved by external things. As for why the flow of time in the hall was different from the outside world, this question was too profound and was completely beyond the level of a soul formation cultivator. Therefore, Shi was at a loss at this moment. He couldn't figure it out. Although the hall was very mysterious, She vaguely felt a sense of anticipation in his heart. Perhaps this hall, which involved the true meaning of time, was not only an excellent place for cultivation, but also a necessary step for him to take another step above the soul formation stage. The hall was too important for Shi. Therefore, when he left, Shi set up an illusion formation around the hall and hid the hall openly. From now on, this would be his secret base. For this, Shi had even made up a very believable story. If Wu Lian started an investigation, he would just have to say that it was all an illusion. The reason why Tiangang and the others were trapped in the hall for more than a month was because they were under an illusion and mistakenly thought that they had been trapped in the hall for more than a month. In reality, they had only slept for one night and had a very, very long dream. Since the hall and the formation were both dreams, then the Azure Dragon was also a product of the dream. From the beginning to the end, Shi only did one thing, and that was to wake them up from their dreams. As for why everyone had the same dream, it was because the illusion was affecting everyone. In addition, the reason why the team had lost members was because the illusion had misled these weak-willed members. It was like sleepwalking, causing them to leave the camp in an unconscious state and then completely disappear in the vast snowy mountains. This trip probably bodes ill rather than well. In short, being able to survive was all due to luck. Everything that everyone experienced was just a dream and illusion. It was a perfect explanation. At the same time, it was Shi's white lie. After all, what was the point of Wu Lian sending so many people if even he couldn't figure it out? I'll fool him first, and he'll slowly investigate in the future. By the time Shi returned to the laboratory, only the two neutralizing grandmasters were awake. When Tiangang and the professors woke up, it was already 10 o'clock in the morning. Because he had almost been possessed by the Azure Dragon, Tiangong's mental state was very bad after waking up. When Shi saw this, he told him to rest well. Although Shi's cultivation was very high, he wasn't an official member of the Wu Lian. Therefore, Tiangang was actually the person in charge of this mission. After that, Shi explained the lie he had made up in detail in front of everyone. When everyone finished listening to his explanation, they all had extremely shocked expressions on their faces. Such a realistic experience was actually just a dream. Although everyone felt that this matter was too strange, there was still time to prove it. Therefore, after digesting it, they could only reluctantly believe Shi's words. This so-called dreamland was indeed a little too ridiculous for them. In fact, if they thought about it carefully, they could find many loopholes in Shi's words. For example, how could they explain the smell of dirt on their bodies after not bathing for more than a month? Also, how could they explain the consumption of food over the past month? There were too many suspicious points. No one was an idiot. However, Shi's words were reasonable and there was also time to prove it. Therefore, no matter how doubtful everyone was, they had to convince themselves to believe Shi's words in the end. After all, they couldn't think of a better explanation. The team had inexplicably lost members. This was a serious matter. Therefore, even though Tiangang still didn't understand the situation, he still honestly recorded everything in the mission log. Just like what Shi said, it was already good enough that they survived. As for what exactly happened last night, this was obviously not a question he should be thinking about now, because he was also a smart person. The snow had been blowing heavily all night. Now it was finally sunny. Tiangang had already seen the strangeness of the oasis. Therefore, the first thing he did after the weather cleared was to move the temporary laboratory to the edge of the oasis. It was about 200 meters away from the oasis on a glacier plain. At this moment, he would rather be in an environment of -50 degrees Celsius in the cold wind than easily get close to the oasis. As long as the professors finished collecting the data, Tiangang could take everyone on a trip and leave. However, this process would take about 10 hours. Because of this, Tiangong's heart was almost in his throat. He could only keep praying in his heart that nothing would go wrong. Unlike Tiangang, who was on tenterhooks, Shi was very calm. After patrolling the area with everyone, Shi stuffed a stone into Tiangong's hand. The spirit fog dissipated and the mysterious 5 elements formation also disappeared. Although the hall didn't disappear, The soul crystal, which was the core of the formation, was in his hands. The danger was gone. So Chun-Shi was thinking, was it time for him to get off work and go home? It was almost noon. If Nian didn't see him when she woke up, would she cry to Ying? When he thought of the little girl's clingy look, Chun-Shi suddenly became eager to go home. He couldn't wait to fly back to the little girl's side. After last night's experience, when Tiangang saw Chun-Shi handing over another stone, he didn't even wait for Chun-Shi to speak. Tiangang rushed to take the stone and smiled. I understand. Mr. Chun, go do your work. I'll throw the stone if there's anything. Hearing this, Chun-Shi suddenly smiled. Saving his life was worth it. This Tiangang was interesting. After talking with Tiangang, Chun-Shi left the Saikan Glacier. When he returned to Chengdu, it was already 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Chun-Shi hid his body and landed in a secluded alley behind Wuhou Shrine Street. He had just walked out of the alley and looked up to see that the entrance of Aunt Zhang's neighborhood was crowded with people. A police car was parked by the side of the road. Many people surrounded the security booth and discussed. Looking at the situation, it seemed that something big had happened in the neighborhood. Although they were separated by a street, Chun-Shi's ears were very sharp. Therefore, when he walked to the neighborhood, a conversation among the onlookers instantly made Chun-Shi frown. I heard that a child was kidnapped. What a big child. 4 or 5 years old. Is it a boy or a girl? Little girl. She looks so obedient. Oh, why don't those bastards get their retribution? Xiao Qiu is so wicked. He's probably been hit by a car and died on the road. Attention Lamakes 666. Chapter 259. There was a child abducted in the community? A 4 or 5-year-old child. A little girl. When Chun-Shi heard this conversation, he couldn't help but frown deeply. Although he also knew that it was impossible for Nian to be abducted. As a father, Chun-Shi still subconsciously thought of Nian, so his heart was more or less a little nervous. There weren't many things in this world that could make him nervous. Nian's safety was obviously the first priority. But Nian couldn't have been abducted. Impossible. Absolutely impossible. Even if the earth exploded, it was impossible. This was because he put a lot of enchantment magic weapons on Nian. Once the enchantment was triggered, even if Chun-Shi was far away on the moon, he would immediately know. Moreover, with Qin Ruoying and Aunt Zhang's meticulousness, it was obviously impossible for them to let Nian run around alone. So they basically eliminated the possibility of Nian getting lost. However, even if he knew that this was impossible, Chun-Shi was still a little worried, so he subconsciously quickened his pace. In the blink of an eye, he had already arrived at the gate of the community. Auntie Zhang's neighborhood was an old-fashioned neighborhood that didn't even have elevators. Naturally, there wouldn't be any grand decorations at the entrance of such a neighborhood. Even the railings for parking fees were only built after cars became popular. There were many people gathered at the gate of the community. Most of them were uncles and aunties above the age of 40. The family who lost the child lived in the building next to Aunt Zhang's. The child's parents had to work, so it was usually the grandparents who took care of the child. Now that the child was lost, the old couple could only sit on the ground and cry helplessly. The old couple was so sad that they couldn't speak. But the onlookers were talking one after another, giving the police who came to check the situation a headache. After all, losing a child attracted more attention than jumping off a building. There were only 3 surveillance cameras in the community, and one of them was at the gate. However, the resolution of these cameras wasn't high, and they were in black and white, so the images looked very blurry. After the police checked the surveillance footage based on the time when the child went missing, it took them a lot of effort to find the footage of the child leaving the neighborhood. The child ran out on her own, but she was following behind a woman riding an electric scooter. It seemed that she was willing. Human traffickers generally like to abduct children under the age of 5 because the children's minds were not fully developed yet. Naturally, they would not be vigilant and would be pleased with toys or candy. Speaking of human traffickers, it was actually an occupation with a long history. In ancient times, there was a saying that there were 3 religions and 9 classes. Human traffickers were one of the 9 classes. In ancient times, they were called demons of time. They did immoral things like abducting people. However, compared to modern times, human traffickers in ancient times were still too naive. After abducting women and children, they would only sell them for money. If the abducted women and children were lucky, they might even be sold to a rich family and live a better life than before. Now, in addition to human trafficking, human traffickers have also found a new way to sell organs. Abduct the child first, sell the organs, and then sell the child for money. If the child couldn't be sold, then break the child's arms and legs and let the child beg. If begging didn't work, then let them steal. What if they couldn't even steal? That was very simple. Throw them into the AIDS ward. If they tested positive for AIDS, they would be assigned to the AIDS team. In the future, they would be responsible for collecting debts. If there was a debt collector who didn't pay up, then they would think of ways to infect the debt collector. In short, they made the best use of everything, and their methods were beyond the imagination of ordinary people. Could be said that, utterly devoid of conscience, to the human traffickers, children were just valuable goods in their eyes. The big goods were boys, and the small goods were girls. Of course, there were only a few such large-scale human traffickers. Ordinary small fish and shrimps would not be so cruel. Nowadays, parents were aware of this, so they would teach their children not to talk to strangers from a young age. Under such circumstances, this woman was able to get the child to leave with her willingly. She was obviously a repeat offender. If she was caught, she would definitely be shot to death. It was just after the new year, and the human traffickers were already at work. Parents with children at home naturally felt afraid. Since one went missing, there was a possibility that a second one would go missing. Therefore, a few onlooking parents immediately used this opportunity to educate their children. Suddenly, the children were so scared that they started to cry. Outside the community was an old street, and there were no cameras. Therefore, the police had to carefully look through the entry and exit records for the entire day. After a long search, they finally found the woman's face. However, this woman had a certain level of anti-detection awareness. She was wearing an ordinary down jacket with a hood, and she even wore a hat. Therefore, the woman's face could not be seen clearly on the surveillance screen. Seeing this, the 2 police officers suddenly looked at each other helplessly. Well, this was probably another unsolved case. It wasn't that they didn't work hard, but they really couldn't do anything. As parents, they didn't look after their children and let their children be abducted by human traffickers. Even if they called the police in time, in this vast sea of people, where could the police find them? They could only walk through the streets and ask door to door. They would be thankful if they could get a little bit of useful information. After all, the human traffickers were not stupid. The kind of idiot who suddenly wanted to commit a crime because of a lack of money was always in the minority. The habitual criminals would definitely plan a retreat in advance. It was indeed difficult to catch. She walked around the crowd into the community. From afar, he saw Aunt Zhang's family and Qin Ruoying, who was holding the little boy. The little boy was lying on Qin Ruoying's body, his 2 hands tightly wrapped around her neck. His little face was full of nervousness and timidity. Aunt Zhang probably took the opportunity to educate him. She squeezed into the crowd and walked in their direction. The little boy stood high and could see far, so before he could get close, he had already seen his father in the crowd. He immediately shouted excitedly, "Papa! Papa!" Seeing this, she immediately smiled and waved at him, then quickly walked to Qin Ruoying's side. When she came over, the little boy immediately reached out his hands and motioned for she to hold him. This action was very common, but the slightly different thing was that when the little boy saw his father this time, his cute little face did not show much of a smile. She was obviously frightened, like a frightened ostrich. As soon as the little boy came into Shi's arms, he immediately leaned his head on Shi's shoulder. Chapter 260. The little girl was scared out of her wits because Auntie Zhang had just taught her a lesson by scaring her. Although the little girl was scared and seemed to be traumatized, she didn't think there was anything wrong with Auntie Zhang's behavior. After all, if she didn't pay attention to education in this area, It would be too late for regrets when the child was taken away by human traffickers. Although that was basically impossible, setting an alarm bell in Yanyan's heart in advance was always a precautionary measure. Human trafficking had always been the most serious topic of this era. Behind it was the dark side of civilized society. Why did human traffickers like to abduct children under the age of 5? It wasn't just because children were easy to deceive, but because children couldn't remember things. After 2 or 3 years, they basically didn't recognize their biological parents. Instead, they would treat the family that adopted them as their closest relatives. After many years, even if the child had a little bit of memory before they were abducted, it was usually just fragmented fragments and not enough for them to recall the complete experience. Ordinary people might feel that this kind of thing was far away from them, so whenever they saw news about it, they felt like they were listening to a book from heaven and had no interest in it at all. But all of this was actually close at hand. According to statistics, there were as many as 20,000 cases of human trafficking of women and children in the country in 2015, but the number of cases that were solved was only 3,000. The solving rate was only 17%, not even 20%. And behind these simple numbers, there were families that were shattered because of the loss of their children, as well as parents who were devastated. Human traffickers didn't need to be ruthless like the underworld, so they usually looked ordinary. They might be kind aunties passing by on the street corner, or they might be honest farmers. But under those seemingly harmless skins, there was a cold and cruel heart. Therefore, in Chen Shi's view, there were 2 kinds of behavior in this world that could be called heinous and could be directly shot once caught. And that was drug dealers and human traffickers. The Western region had always been the disaster area of human trafficking cases. Although Chengdu had successfully become a new first-tier city in recent years, this kind of thing was still a common occurrence. Auntie Zhang's goal of educating the child had been achieved, so she waved her hand and asked everyone to go home. During this time, she pursed her lips and didn't say a single word. In fact, whether it was Aunt Zhang or the onlookers, they could only feel a deep sense of helplessness at the same time. This also caused the atmosphere at the entrance of the residential area to be very oppressive. The old couple who had lost their child sat on the ground and cried miserably. That pitiful look really made people feel sad. After all, they were all people with children. As long as they imagined that their child was lost, that feeling of despair and helplessness would immediately surge into their hearts. He truly felt the same way. The police quickly understood what had happened, so they wanted to invite the 2 elders back to the police station to start the investigation. But just as they were about to help the old couple leave, the old lady, whose tears had dried up from crying, suddenly staggered and covered her chest with her hands. Then, she suddenly fell on her back. This sudden turn of events was like a splash of water falling into a pot of oil, causing an uproar among the crowd. Call 120. Grandma Lu fainted. Does anyone know anything about medicine? Come and take a look. Big Sister Lu's heart is not good. Is it a heart attack? Her medicine? Quick! Someone get the medicine from her house. Everyone, make way. She's having a heart attack. We need to maintain ventilation. Do any of you know where her house is? The patient's house should have a quick-acting heart rescue pill. Go and look for it. I know. I'll go get it. Master Li, give me the house key. Where's Big Sister Lu's medicine? I'll go get it for her. The police hurriedly performed cardiopulmonary resuscitation on the old man while yelling and assigning tasks to the onlookers. After hearing that there might be medicine in the old lady's house, a middle-aged man quickly squeezed to the old couple's side and asked the old man to give him the house key. However, the old man was already panicking. He trembled as he searched his body, but he couldn't find the house key after a while. It seemed like he had completely forgotten where he had put the key. Seeing that he couldn't find the key, the old man was anxious and scared. He cried on the spot. I can't find it. I can't find it. I don't know where I put the key. Seeing this, the middle-aged man turned around and ran. As he ran, he shouted, Come! Come with me and smash the door. After hearing the middle-aged man's words, the old man's face became even more sorrowful. He cried at the top of his lungs, You can't smash it open. My house has a burglar-proof door. The old man lived on the first floor, so the burglar-proof doors and windows were reinforced. He didn't expect that it would become his wife's death warrant. How could he not feel despair? An old man in his 60s or 70s was now like a child who couldn't find his home. He could only sit on the ground and cry helplessly. These heavy blows one after another had obviously caused the old man to completely collapse. Just as the scene was in chaos, a calm voice suddenly sounded from behind the police. "Police comrade, I'm a doctor from Huaxi's cardiovascular department. Can you let me take a look at the situation?" Hearing this, the police who were performing CPR on the old man was overjoyed. He immediately stood up and shouted, Come, doctor, come and take a look." This doctor who came like timely rain was obviously Chun Shi. Based on the old man's current situation, it should not be a simple heart attack. It should be a myocardial infarction caused by excessive stimulation. To explain it in professional terms, the old man's emotional agitation caused his blood pressure to rise sharply. The burden on the left ventricle was obviously increased, the secretion of catecholamines increased, the demand for oxygen and blood in the myocardium increased, and the coronary artery was obviously insufficient, resulting in myocardial infarction and sudden cardiac arrest. Myocardial infarction was an extremely dangerous state. Could be said to be half a step into the gates of hell. The golden time for rescue usually did not exceed 30 seconds. The two police officers present had only learned some simple first aid skills, so they could not see the seriousness of the problem at all. They did not even realize. The old man's heart had stopped beating. Chun Shi squatted beside the old man and pretended to pinch the old man's philtrum. Only then did he quietly release his true vitality. He used true vitality to inject oxygen into the old man's brain and wrapped the old man's heart with his true vitality. After that, Chun Shi controlled his true vitality and began to slowly squeeze the old man's heart, forcibly simulating the state of the old man's normal heartbeat. Thump, thump, thump. Finally, Chun Shi's efforts were not in vain. After about 2 minutes, the old man lying on the ground suddenly frowned and then coughed violently. Seeing this, the surrounding crowd suddenly burst into a burst of loud cheers. Chapter 261. Seeing that her father had saved someone, the expression on the little girl's face suddenly became triumphant. Everyone praised Chun Shi loudly. After a few polite and modest words, Chun Shi retreated to the back of the crowd with Ying and Yan. His appearance was like a sudden ray of light in the darkness. Even if the old man was half a step into the gates of hell, Chun Shi still managed to save the old man very smoothly. In the news, it was often seen that the old lady would suddenly die shortly after she had a dispute with others. A large part of the reason was that the old lady's heart was not good. If she was not careful and was stimulated, she could die of sudden cardiac death. The police were also frightened by the old lady's physical condition, so they did not dare to ask them to go back to the police station now. They could only wait for the ambulance to come and send the old lady to the hospital for a checkup. However, even though the old lady was lucky to survive, the first thing she did after waking up was to look at the crowd and cry, "Where is my granddaughter? Where is my granddaughter?" When the old man saw his wife's sad look, he could not help but feel sad. The old couple immediately hugged each other and cried bitterly. The old lady was so pitiful. This also made Qin Ruoying feel kind. So, she gently tugged at Chun Shi's clothes and asked in a low voice, "Shi, can you help them?" Chun Shi turned his head and saw his wife's slightly expectant gaze. He could not help but nod. But then he frowned slightly. After all, it was very troublesome to find a person in a vast sea of people. If it were not for his sister-in-law taking the initiative to come to him, Chun Shi might not have found Qin Ruoying until now. So he was also aware of the difficulties. However, this kind of thing happened in front of him. Seeing the old lady's pitiful appearance, Chun Shi still felt a little sorry for her. So he made up his mind to find their child for them. As for how to find her, he had to think about it carefully. So, Chun Shi came to the security room and asked to see the surveillance video. Because he had just saved the old lady, the security guard's attitude towards him was very friendly. Almost as soon as Chun Shi suggested his idea, the security guard began to retrieve the surveillance footage for him. I saw that woman come in. She was riding a battery-powered scooter. She should be in her 40s or 50s, but it was just a glimpse, so I can't remember clearly. Do you have a picture of the child? Yes, this is a recent photo of the doll. Uncle Lee just showed this to the police. I saved a copy, and I'm going to put up a missing person notice on the door later. She looked at the child's photo carefully. After memorizing the child's appearance, he nodded and said to the security guard, "Okay, I'll go out and ask my friends to help me see if there are any clues about the child." After seeing the surveillance camera and the child's photo from the security guard, Shi returned to Qin Ruoying's side. When the little fellow heard that her father was going to help find someone, she immediately pulled a long face and cheered for Chen Shi righteously. "Papa, you can do it. I'll wait for you at home." Well, this little thing now knows how to help others, however. Finding someone was not as simple as what was shown in the movies. It was possible to hack into the Skynet system and then use a computer to scan and compare. Although this operation was feasible to a certain extent, the success rate was far lower than imagined. After all, as long as it was not an impulsive crime, the criminals would definitely check out the place in advance and try to avoid the surveillance cameras when committing the crime. They would also disguise themselves to a certain extent. Although Shi's divine sense had recovered a little, the range was still too small. The scanning radius of only more than 10 meters was not even as far as he could see directly with his eyes. Because the injury to his divine sense had not fully recovered, Shi could not use search spells such as bloodline tracking or divine sense searching. Now, it was really too difficult for him to find a child who had been abducted and sold in a city with an area of more than 800 square kilometers and a resident population of more than 10 million. However, although it was difficult, since he had promised Ying that he would help the old lady, Shi would try his best to do it. He would just take it as accumulating good karma for himself. Although he could not directly find out the whereabouts of the human traffickers, Shi could use his own reasoning to find them. How to reason? It was actually very simple. First of all, the left turn out of the neighborhood was Wuho Temple Street, and the right turn was the alley where Shi had landed on his way back. After the human traffickers had deceived the child, it was impossible for them to run to the main street, so the alley without cameras was the only choice. The child was about the same age as Nian. At the age of 4, the child already had his own consciousness. Once the child found out that he had been deceived, he would definitely cry and make a fuss. Therefore, the human traffickers would not choose to leave Chengdu by bus or train. They must have their own means of transportation, and it was very likely that it was a cheap and affordable van or a second-hand car. Of course, if the human traffickers did not have a means of transportation, it would be easier. They would definitely temporarily put the child in a stronghold and then contact a car for transportation. Time was another key clue. From the time the child went missing until now, it had not been more than an hour. In just a short hour, a human trafficker who had successfully abducted a child would not dare to take the child through the streets and alleys and wander around the main streets of Chengdu. Therefore, the child was now either in a stronghold nearby or in a van that was heading out of the city. Thinking of this, Shi immediately called Qin Shueqing. After briefly explaining the matter to his sister-in-law, Qin Shueqing immediately replied on the other end of the phone, "Yes, I will immediately arrange for people to set up surveillance checks on all the roads out of the city." Speaking of this, Qin Shueqing did not forget to remind him, "However, you better not have too much hope for this kind of phishing operation. It's okay, as long as you do your best." After asking his sister-in-law to help set up surveillance checks on the roads, Shi carefully searched the nearby slums. If the child was not in the van, then he must be nearby. However, when he was searching, Shi did not have any intention of asking people on the streets. The reason was very simple. Not everyone was like him. Even if a human trafficker passed by the shop owner with the child, the shop owner would not necessarily remember that he had seen such a person before. After all, in daily life, unless one was bored to death, who would deliberately remember the appearance of a passerby? Shi flew in the sky and carefully observed the environment of the streets below. In recent years, the buildings in Chengdu had been getting taller and taller, but there were still many slums that had not been renovated within the second ring road. Aunt Zhang's house was in an old neighborhood, so although there was a bustling Wuho temple outside the neighborhood, there was a large slum area that was waiting to be renovated behind it. The living conditions in the slums were poor, and the rent was low. Most of the people who lived here were foreigners who came to Chengdu to work. She flew slowly in the sky, and at the same time, he constantly observed the distribution of the nearby cameras. He could only rely on his intuition to find the child. After all, human traffickers were also a kind of head-killing business. It was not because of the law, but because once they were caught by the people, they could be beaten to death by angry people. Therefore, from the perspective of a human trafficker, they naturally had to hide in a secluded and safe place, and there were definitely not many cameras near that place. She studied for a while, then chose an old tube-shaped apartment, and then directly flew to the roof of the apartment. Then, he took out the soul crystal from his pocket. Chapter 262. The tube-shaped apartment was a unique product of the 70s and 80s. This kind of house was like a student dormitory today. There was a long corridor connecting many single rooms, each of which was about 10 square meters. The living environment in the tube-shaped apartment was very poor, and because it had been in disrepair for many years, most of it had become dangerous. The owners basically looked forward to urban renovation and demolition all day long. Since the living conditions were so bad, it was obvious that the rent was very cheap. Perhaps because the new year had just started, most of the migrant workers were still in their hometown and had not returned to the city to work, so there were not many residents in this tube-shaped apartment. She sat cross-legged on the rooftop, then held the soul crystal in his hand. He wanted to use the soul crystal to expand the range of his divine sense, so that he could carefully search this shantytown. If he couldn't find it, then he could only put all his hopes on his sister-in-law. Although she was not his child, he had already promised to help the old man find his child, so she naturally had to do his best. Therefore, after a simple adjustment, she calmed his breath, then drove his divine sense into the soul crystal. The moment his divine sense entered the soul crystal, she seemed to have become a dolphin, and began to spread his divine sense outward in a way similar to using sonar. What was divine sense? It was a way of perception that transcended the five senses, somewhat similar to the legendary sixth sense. Even if she closed his eyes, with him as the center, everything within a radius of hundreds of meters was under his control. A world in a flower, a Bodhi in a leaf. Within the range of his divine sense, he could immediately detect the slightest movement of everything in the world. Even the tiny flies in the gutter, or the earthworms hidden in the soil, no matter how well they hid, could not escape She's discerning eyes. This was divine sense. The tube-shaped apartment was a dormitory that the public institution had assigned to the employees in the past. There were a total of 3 buildings, covering an area of about 2,000 square meters. With the enhancement of the soul crystal, she scanned the 3 buildings almost instantly. Good Lord, this scan is amazing. She was now on the rooftop of Building 1, and there was actually a corpse hidden in the building below him. Why was it hidden? It was because the corpse was sealed with cement in the bathroom at the end of the corridor. The toilets and bathrooms in the apartment were all shared. The body was under the sink in the bathroom, sealed inside with cement and bricks. In addition to the corpses, there were also many drugs hidden in these 3 buildings. Presumably, there were many drug addicts living here. It had to be said that she had found the right place. This place could be said to be filthy and filthy. It should be flattened with a cannonball. In addition to the corpses and drugs, in an inconspicuous room at the corner of the top floor of building number 3, she found more than a dozen children who were hidden by the human traffickers. Among these children, the youngest should only be 1 or 2 years old, and the oldest should be 6 or 7 years old. In addition to the children, there was also a girl who was about 16 or 17 years old. It was obvious that these human traffickers had abducted humans as well as children. How long had it been since the Chinese New Year? Looking at the situation, these bastards must have made a fortune during the Chinese New Year. After all, according to the market price, the total value of these children and young girls added up to more than 700,000 yuan. According to the Central Guang Night News, according to different statistics, the number of missing children in Wuxia every year was about 200,000, and only 0.1% of them were found. If calculated according to the average market price, then this was really an industry with a production value of over 100 million yuan. The granddaughter of the old couple was called Ting Ting. Because Nian had just come to Aunt Zhang's house, she had not played with Ting Ting yet. Ting Ting was among the children. Perhaps it was because she had just arrived, but she was in good spirits and was struggling particularly hard. The children were abducted, so the human traffickers naturally would not provide them with good food and drinks. In the eyes of the human traffickers, these children were valuable goods, so in addition to tying the children's hands and feet firmly with ropes, the human traffickers also used towels to gag their mouths. The children were lying on the ground crookedly. Even if they could not speak, they still kept making woo-woo sounds out of fear. Because they cried so hard, one of the children's eyes were so swollen that only a slit was left. This scene made Chen Shi very uncomfortable. After all, he also had children. If someone tied Nian up and threw her on the ground like this, he really could not imagine what a father would do in a rage. Therefore, the moment he saw this scene, Chen Shi expressionlessly withdrew his divine sense, then got up and flew to building number 3. There was only one adult in the room, a woman in her 30s. The woman seemed to be in a good mood. At this moment, she was squatting next to the pitiful young girl, and holding the young girl's chin with one hand and taking photos with her phone with the other. Looking at this situation, she seemed to want to sell this young girl for a good price. Chen Shi flew to the top of the room where the children were locked up, but he did not immediately act. Instead, he sat cross-legged on the rooftop. He was waiting for the woman's accomplice to come back. As a family, the most important thing was to be neat. Chen Shi sat patiently on the rooftop. It was not until around 6 o'clock in the evening that the woman's accomplice came back one by one. When all the human traffickers gathered on the first floor to prepare for dinner, Chen Shi realized that this human trafficking organization was much bigger than he thought. They rented this building, and it seemed that there were at least 20 to 30 people, men and women, old and young. Among them, the youngest should be around 20 years old. They should all be from the same village, earning money together and committing crimes together. They usually lived in this cheap tube-shaped building, and then they would wander around in groups of 3 to 5 in the name of working. Once they found a target, they would start to plan the operation. Some were responsible for scamming, some were responsible for robbing, and some were responsible for keeping watch, scouting, and logistics. Although they were small, they had all the essentials. Among these children, some were caught before the new year, but they did not choose to ship the goods during the new year. Instead, they chose to ship the goods after the new year. Moreover, when they shipped the goods, they divided them into several batches to avoid being caught by the police. They were very experienced in committing crimes. Chen Shi was also very patient, and waited quietly for more than 3 hours. It was not until 10 o'clock in the evening when 8 or 9 people came back that he stood up and slowly stretched. It should be about time. Chapter 263. In order to avoid alerting the enemy, Chen Shi could only wait silently on the rooftop. He sat cross-legged and looked up at the night sky of Chengdu. He felt that the tears of the children had seeped through the walls and soaked the floor. He looked at the group of people gathered under the apartment building. Under the light, they were not human at all, but evil spirits that wandered the dark side of society. Because they had been tied up for a long time, the parts of the children that were bound by the rope had begun to have edema. When Chen Shi saw this scene, he could not help but feel sorry for these children. How old were these children? They were treated like livestock. How much damage would this cause to the children's young hearts? As a human being, at the very least, Chen Shi did not see any kindness in these human traffickers. Many people always wondered why the human traffickers had their own families. They worked hard just to better take care of their families, but they still did such a heartless thing. In fact, the reason was very simple. In everyone's eyes, children were gifts given to them by God. But in the eyes of human traffickers, children were just goods that could be sold for money. Children were pure and beautiful, and every one of them was so cute. It was not an exaggeration to say that which child was not more likable than Yanyan. For the parents of children, their children were obviously the most precious treasures in the world. In order to catch these bastards in one fell swoop, She waited for a long time, but he also let these poor children suffer for a few more hours of torture in vain. But fortunately, all of this should end. Like a phantom in the dark, She's figure suddenly disappeared from the rooftop. When he reappeared, he was already outside the door of the room on the top floor where the children were locked up. It was still the woman in her 30s who was guarding the children. And why was the man not allowed to guard the children? Obviously, it was because there was a little girl here. As a man, there were always times when he could not control himself. This little girl was going to be sold for money. If she was accidentally broken, who would be willing to spend money to buy her? Therefore, in human trafficking organizations, it was usually women who guarded the goods. The door was not locked, and the woman was sitting on a chair not far from the door. She was watching a TV series on her phone. The moment she pushed the door open, the woman heard the sound of the door opening. However, she seemed to be engrossed in watching, so she didn't even raise her head as she spoke in a rather difficult dialect. She didn't pay attention to her, but looked at the children sitting on the ground. It was probably because they were tired from crying that the children were already asleep. Only the little girl who heard the sound of she opening the door immediately raised her head and looked outside vigilantly. There was only an old light bulb in the room. Under the dim light, the sudden appearance of a strange man made the girl shrink back in fear. The little girl's movements made a rustling sound. After hearing this sound, the woman in the room finally raised her head impatiently and directly shouted in She's direction. She thought it was a pervert who wanted to take advantage of this little girl. This kind of thing happened more than once, so she didn't care at all, but she didn't expect that after looking up. She found that she didn't know the man in front of her at all. The woman was stunned. She was stunned for a second or two. Then, her eyes suddenly widened, and she was about to scream. But at the moment when she was about to scream, she suddenly stretched out his arm, and the invisible true spirit suddenly clasped the woman's neck like an iron hoop. Want to call for help? The two were at least 2 meters apart. She just grabbed in the air, and the woman was suddenly lifted from the chair by him like a chicken. The pressure on her neck made the woman almost suffocated, but she still opened her eyes and mouth, trying to make a sound. Seeing this, she said calmly, "I'll help you." After the voice fell, she gently waved his arm. The woman's body was like a marionette. Under the pull of an invisible force, she instantly broke the window and flew directly out of the 5th floor. Then the question came. How long would it take for an object to fall freely from the height of a 5-story building to fall to the ground? The answer was, with a muffled sound from downstairs, the entire apartment was alarmed. Like a sudden power outage in the student apartment, screams and footsteps suddenly came from downstairs. This scene happened in front of the little girl, but she stared with her red eyes, as if she didn't come back to her senses at all. Seeing her silly look, she couldn't help but smile at her. Then he gently snapped his fingers. "Go to sleep, you'll be fine when you wake up." Under the effect of the meditation spell, the little girl leaned weakly against the wall, and her consciousness became more and more blurred. She tried hard to remember the appearance of the man in front of her, but the strong sleepiness made her instantly fall asleep. After the little girl fell asleep, she turned his head to look at the child in the room. After cutting all the ropes with his true essence, he turned and walked out of the room. 30 to 40 people ran wildly in the apartment, and the floor made a bang-bang sound as they stepped on it. Listening to the gradually approaching footsteps, she sighed rather helplessly. It would be great if he could just slaughter all of these scumbags. But he couldn't do that. Because this kind of large-scale human trafficking organization had abducted and sold countless children, he couldn't kill all of these bastards for a moment of pleasure. He had to leave some alive for the police to find the children they had abducted before. After all, there were so many broken families who were still holding on to a glimmer of hope that they could find their children even if they had to use up all their wealth. What a pity. And just as she stood in the corridor thinking about how to deal with these human traffickers, The fastest among them had already rushed in front of him with steel pipes and kitchen knives. Seeing this, Qianxi's face couldn't help but darken, and he suddenly made a decision in his heart. In terms of probability, when an earthquake happened, there would always be a few lucky people in a building who would be able to survive. In that case, let God decide who would die and who would live. So, just as the few men were about to rush in front of Qianxi fiercely stepped on the floor of the corridor. A huge force suddenly went from the roof to the foundation, and almost instantly shook the load-bearing walls of the entire building. Just like an earthquake, the entire building was like a building that had been crushed, and it quickly collapsed amidst the dust that filled the air. At the same time, Qianxi used his true essence to wrap the little girl and the children. After putting the children on the street outside the apartment, Qianxi called his sister-in-law's phone. The apartment collapsed, but the number of lucky survivors was beyond Qianxi's imagination. This also made him sigh. These bastards' luck was actually so good. Did the heavens have eyes? So, when he ended the call with his sister-in-law, Qianxi didn't forget to repeatedly remind her, "Death penalty, it must be the death penalty, remember? Good will be rewarded with good, evil with evil. If there is no justice in heaven, I will." Chapter 264. The next morning. The whole family was sitting around the dining table, happily eating breakfast. At this moment, the morning news suddenly broadcasted a news flash. Last night, the Chengdu police cracked a huge case of baby trafficking. They arrested 37 suspects and rescued 16 babies. The reporter has called the person in charge of the case, but as the case is still under investigation, the specific details cannot be disclosed for the time being. Then, the TV screen cut to the Wuhou branch. Many parents were anxiously waiting outside the conference room. After receiving the police summons, the parents rushed into the conference room and began to frantically search for their children. Only 16 children were rescued, but there were hundreds of parents present. After all, the police didn't know which family these children belonged to. Therefore, they could only invite the parents who had recently lost their children to come over and hold such a family reunion. The old couple was quite lucky. The first thing they saw after entering was their granddaughter, Tingting. The two elders quickly walked to Tingting. When they saw the abrasions and edema on the child's body, the old couple could not help but cry on the spot. These were tears of joy, and at the same time, the joy of surviving a disaster. The old couple hugged their granddaughter and cried for a long time. After their emotions had calmed down, they went to the side and began to register under the guidance of the police. The image came to an abrupt end. The camera cut back to the live broadcast room. After a few simple comments, the host smiled and began to broadcast the next piece of news. News always reported the good news and not the bad news. And this reunion was no less than a second blow to the parents who had lost their children. It was fine if they found them, but what if they could not? As the saying goes, the greater the expectation, the greater the disappointment. They came to the reunion with unlimited expectations, but in the end, they could only watch as others found their children, while their own children were still nowhere to be found. How strong did one have to be able to endure such endless torment? Therefore, at the end of the reunion, it would always be filled with the cries of despair of the parents. Those who heard it would be sad, and those who heard it would cry. Such a scene was naturally not suitable to appear in the news. As a bystander, Aunt Zhang, like most people, did not delve into the details. Therefore, when she saw the old couple find Tingting on TV, she couldn't help but laugh and say, "It's good that you found her. It's good that you found her." Speaking of this, Aunt Zhang did not forget to reach out and pat the little girl's head. Then, she pretended to be serious and said to her, "Nian Nian, if you don't listen to me in the future, Grandma will sell you to human traffickers. What do you think?" Hearing Auntie Zhang's words, the little boy was frightened and immediately shook his head like a rattledrum. He pouted and said loudly, "No, you're not allowed to sell me." As it spoke, the little thing burrowed into Qin Ruoying's arms. Aunt Zhang couldn't help but laugh out loud at the silly look on his face. "Silly child, Grandma is just teasing you. You were so cute. How could Grandma be willing to sell you? Qin Ruoying comforted her with a smile. Hearing this, the little fellow pouted and snorted, and then expressed its strong dissatisfaction. Children also have human rights. Breakfast ended in such a happy atmosphere. After Kai Shuqin and Xie Pinglin left for work, Aunt Zhang packed up and prepared to bring Qi's family out to play. However, because she still had to take care of her granddaughter, Aunt Zhang was busy for a while and didn't finish packing. During this time, she discussed with Qin Ruoying softly. The new year was over, so it was about time for them to leave. They couldn't always stay at Aunt Zhang's house and freeload on food and drinks, right? Therefore, after a brief discussion, she brought up their plans to Auntie Zhang. After leaving Chengdu, they would go to Zhonghai for a few days to reminisce about the past before returning to Shangjing. After returning to Shangjing, they couldn't let the little girl play so carefree anymore. They had to find a kindergarten for her and let her become a preschool child. This time, she would study seriously in a big class, unlike the past where she would slack off. Therefore, Chun Shi and Qin Ruoying didn't discuss with the little girl at all and directly decided everything for her. Although Aunt Zhang was very reluctant, after hearing the detailed plan, she still agreed to it. However, they could leave, but they had to wait until the new year. Since Aunt Zhang had already said so, the husband and wife naturally couldn't go against her wishes. So they followed the old lady's wishes and stayed with her for a few more days until the Lantern Festival. After that, the family went out and prepared to take advantage of the last few days to play all over Chengdu. It had to be said that the internet era was indeed convenient for people's lives. After Shi rented a shared car with his phone, he drove the family happily to Huanglongxi. Chengdu couldn't be compared to Shangjing. There were only a few scenic spots to play in, and Huanglongxi was a relatively good vacation spot in the surrounding area. However, since Shi came back, he took the little girl to see 5 scenic spots. In addition, she lived in Hohai for a long time, so naturally, she had a certain immunity to this kind of retro old street and didn't have the slightest interest. Therefore, after wandering around aimlessly for a while, she clamored to find another place to play. She had no choice but to drive her around. It wasn't until Qin Ruoying found out that there was a marine park nearby that the little girl's big eyes finally lit up again. The scale of this marine park wasn't large, but the little girl had never been to a place like this before. After all, there was no harm without comparison. This also made her very happy. Along the way, she pointed at the fish in the water tank and asked questions. Why is this fish so big? Why does this fish have feet? Why is this fish glowing? Her understanding of marine life was still limited. As long as it lived in the water, it was a fish. This trip was quite pleasant. Before leaving, she bought the little girl a dolphin pillow, which made her smile from ear to ear. Out of the aquarium, there was a shopping mall not far away. When the little girl held Qin Ruoying's hand and waited outside for Shi to drive out, she suddenly noticed the shared bicycle next to them. Shared bicycle. She still didn't know how to ride a bicycle. Hohai's streets were small, so it was rare to see shared bicycles riding here. Now that she suddenly saw so many shared bicycles, it immediately made the little girl envious. Mama, I want to ride this. Looking at everyone riding the shared bicycle, the little girl pouted on the spot and acted coquettishly. Seeing this, Qin Ruoying said to her with an awkward face, "No, you're still young. You can't ride this. This is not for children to ride. I want to ride this. I want to ride this." Seeing that Qin Ruoying didn't agree, the little girl immediately withdrew her hands and ran to one of the bicycles. After she drove the car out of the parking lot, the mother and daughter were still whispering, discussing, next to the shared bicycle. Chapter 265. She drove the car out of the parking lot. Just as he turned the corner, he saw the mother and daughter who were discussing. The wife was dignified, elegant, and charming. The daughter was innocent, lively, and cute. For a father, this scene might be the most beautiful scene in the world. Qin Ruoying didn't notice that she had already driven the car out. She was still trying to persuade the little guy to give up riding the bicycle. However, the little guy was now completely carried away. He didn't listen to his mother's words as usual. Seeing that his mother didn't help him, the little guy ran to find a small yellow bicycle, and then stood aside thinking about how he should sit on it. The yellow bicycle was the shortest bike in the shared bicycle, but even if the saddle was the shortest, it wasn't something a 5-year-old child could play with. Looking at the pedestrians coming and going on the shared bicycle, the little guy directly sat on the horizontal tube in the middle of the yellow bicycle. Then he raised his hands and tightly grabbed the handles on both sides. In fact, it wasn't right to say that it was a horizontal tube because the yellow bicycle was a low-span bicycle. This kind of shape was generally configured for women's bicycles, and women's bicycles naturally couldn't have a large horizontal bar like the old bicycle, so even a child of a few years old could easily ride it. Of course, the premise was that the child could ride a bicycle. After the little guy strained his legs over the horizontal tube, he sat on the horizontal tube, and then used his 2 short legs to step on the ground and tried to move the bicycle. Not to mention that the bicycle wasn't unlocked. Even if the lock was unlocked, whether the little guy could hold on and not let the bicycle fall was a problem. So for a child, the shared bicycle really wasn't a toy, but was very likely to be a weapon. Seeing this, Qin Ruoying could only sigh deeply, and then the expression on her face became serious for the first time. It seemed that he was going to flip out. She was also forced to have no choice. After all, in front of the child, one had to play the good cop, and the other had to play the bad cop, right? She spoiled the little guy so much, so the annoying thing of playing the bad cop was not only done by her. Qin Ruoying, who had always been dignified and elegant, was now going to flip out at the child on the street. Presumably, this was one of the compulsory lessons for the goddess after she became a married woman. However, just when Qin Ruoying was about to flip out, a horn suddenly sounded from the street next to them. Qin Ruoying looked back and saw that she had already driven to their side. After seeing Qin Ruoying's helpless expression, she immediately understood what had just happened. So, he quickly rolled down the window, and then shouted at the little guy who was still trying to ride, "Nian, Nian, do you want to go to heaven?" After hearing his father's call, the little thing immediately looked up at Chen Shi and grinned, "Papa, this is fun. I want to ride." As she spoke, she twisted the bell on the bike, but the more she twisted it, the more energetic she became. At this time, Aunt Zhang, who was sitting in the back, could not stand it anymore, so she said to Chen Shi, "Why aren't you going to carry her back? Look at how you've spoiled her." Chen Shi was inexplicably scolded, and he did not know whether to laugh or cry. Just when Chen Shi opened the door and got off, Aunt Zhang did not forget to remind him, "Be careful. Don't let her fall." It could be seen that Grandma really had a sharp tongue but a soft heart for her granddaughter. After giving Qin Ruoying a look, Chen Shi quietly went behind the little guy, and then, when she was not paying attention, he lifted her up by her armpits. If it was in the past, the little guy would be overjoyed to be ambushed by her father. But today, she might be relying on this shared bike. Therefore, when she realized that she was being carried away by her father, the little guy burst into tears on the spot. Before Papa and Mama got angry, the little guy was the first to flip out. The sudden crying almost scared Chen Shi, so he quickly touched the back of her head and comforted her. "Woo-woo, Nian, don't cry, don't cry. You're so young, so you can't ride a shared bike. Papa will ride with you in the future, okay?" Hearing this, the little guy cried even louder. What should they do? The couple could not help but look at each other, and neither of them hardened their hearts to play the role of the good cop. At this time, it was natural for the elderly to step in. Aunt Zhang asked Chen Shi to put the little guy in the back. Then she quietly communicated with the little guy. "Don't cry. If you cry again, I'll sell you to human traffickers. Nian, look at you now, you're not likable anymore. Do you still remember what you told Grandma before? Isn't our Nian the most obedient and sensible? Be good, you have to listen to Papa and Mama. If you make Papa and Mama angry again, be careful that they throw you away again. Then you can only live with Grandma in the future." "What? You don't want to live with Grandma? Grandma is so sad. My granddaughter doesn't want me anymore." After all, she was a child that the elderly had personally raised. After a round of threats and temptations, Aunt Zhang managed to divert the little guy's attention to other places. The little guy did not even wipe his tears before he took the initiative to hug Aunt Zhang and said softly, "I want Grandma. Grandma is the best. The older, the wiser." Actually, it was possible to scare the child, but one must not use it as a tactic. After scaring the child to make him realize that he was wrong, it was necessary to divert the child's attention in time and let them temporarily forget what was in front of them. Otherwise, it was very likely that overdoing it would be as bad as not doing enough. If it was more serious, it could even cause a certain degree of psychological trauma to the child. Aunt Zhang educated the little guy in a low voice, but her words were passed to the couple's ears without missing a word. The couple sat in the front row. At some point, Chun-Chi's hand was no longer on the gear lever, but stretched out to the front passenger seat. The two silently felt the warmth from each other's palms. When the little guy's laughter sounded again, Qin Ruoying smiled and patted Chun-Chi's hand away, then pointed to the road ahead and said with a smile, "Drive carefully." "Okay, yes, Maram." The car was quiet, so Chun-Chi turned on the radio. Maybe it was set up by the previous tenant, so when it was turned on, it was the traffic radio channel. Pleasant music suddenly sounded in the car. This song could be considered a familiar Cantonese song. After listening to a sentence, Chun-Chi could not help but hum along with the radio. The little guy seemed to have completely forgotten the previous unhappiness. So when she heard Chun-Chi sing, she immediately laughed and clapped her hands. "Papa sings well. It's so good. How good is it? It's better than him. Little mouth is so sweet. Come, give Papa a MUA. What are you doing? You're driving. Pay attention to the road." For a moment, the car was full of the family's laughter. "Hard to leave, hard to leave. I want to hold on tight. The vast life is like the wilderness, like a child can lean on his father's shoulder. Who wants to get off the car? There are always some things that are hard to leave. Common sense is so inescapable. No matter how cold the world is thinking of this bicycle, there is still happiness to be borrowed." Chapter 266. In the blink of an eye, it was March 2nd. It was the 15th day of the first lunar month, the Lantern Festival. The little girl did not like to watch the gala performances on TV, so the family went out together after dinner. Where were they going? Of course, they were going to enjoy the lanterns. The Lantern Festival began more than 2,000 years ago in the Han Dynasty and had always been a major festival in Wuxia. According to the ancient customs, the new year was only truly over after the Lantern Festival. However, the pace of life was getting faster and faster. Even though the legal holiday stipulated that people would only go to work on the 7th day, many private enterprises still required people to start work on the 5th day. Among them, there were even more, such as the catering and entertainment industry. They might open for business on the eve of the new year, so the employees naturally could not rest. Such a pace of life directly led to the Lantern Festival almost following in the footsteps of the Dragon Boat Festival. With the decline of the Lantern Festival, the lively scene described by Xian Qiji in Green Jade Case, Yuan Shi, was naturally no longer as lively as before. The east wind blossoms 1,000 trees, blowing down the stars like rain. The fragrance of precious horses and carts fills the road. The sound of Feng Shao moves. The light of a pot turns. Fish and dragons dance in the night. Moths flutter in the wind, inging and laughing in the wind. He searched for her thousands of times in the crowd, but when he looked back, she was at the fire. Today was Friday. Although the public institutions were on holiday, most private enterprises still had to work tomorrow. In addition, everyone might be tired of playing during the new year, so the Wuho Temple Street was not as lively as it was during the Spring Festival. After leaving the house, the family took a taxi and went straight to the Panda Lantern Festival. The moon on the 15th was full and round, but what was more dazzling than the moon was the colorful Lantern Festival. Because they set off late, by the time Qin Shi and the rest arrived at the Lantern Festival, it was already a 10-mile-long street with brilliant lights. As soon as they got out of the car, the fragrance of magnolia drifted to the tip of everyone's nose in the breeze. The little girl sniffed the fragrance in the air and turned her head to see the entrance of the Lantern Festival. There were a few panda lanterns outside the lantern festival. Although they were ugly and cute, they made her shout excitedly. "Papa, look! Panda! Panda!" In fact, to this little girl, there was not much difference between going to the lantern festival and going to the zoo. She was dazzled by the colorful lanterns in all kinds of shapes and sizes. She chattered excitedly all the way. In Chun-Chi's eyes, this lantern festival was somewhat similar to the Earth Temple Fair. Other than strolling around, there was only eating, drinking, and playing. However, what was worth praising was that the food in Chengdu was indeed much better than the food in Shangjing. The whole family ate and watched along the way. After admiring the lanterns, they watched the magic show. Finally, under the illumination of the fireworks, they sat in the car and went home with satisfaction. In the end, this trip to Chengdu was still very pleasant. The next morning, after breakfast, Chun-Chi pulled the little girl to his side and asked with a smile, "Ninian, Daddy has already bought the plane tickets. We'll fly back to Zhonghai later and visit our old home. Okay?" "All right." The little thing's eyes lit up at the mention of taking a plane. Seeing this, Chun-Chi struck while the iron was hot and said, "Then go and help your mother pack her things now. After she is done, we will set off." "Good. I'll go help Mama." Everything went smoothly. It wasn't until Chun-Chi changed the boarding pass and took her to say goodbye to Aunt Zhang that the little thing suddenly froze in place. After staring blankly for a long while, she suddenly came back to her senses. Was she going to say goodbye to her grandmother? She thought Aunt Zhang was going to go home with them. When Chun-Chi saw that the little girl's expression was a little strange, he immediately smiled and hugged her in his arms. He gently comforted her and said, "Nian, we should get on the plane. Hurry and say goodbye to your grandmother. We'll come to Chengdu to see her again in the future." Perhaps it was because this period of time together had aroused her dependence on Aunt Zhang. So when the little girl came back to her senses, she immediately said very angrily, "No, I'm not going. I want to go with my grandmother." This expression of anger rarely appeared on the little girl's face. So when Chun-Chi saw her expression, he was quite surprised. The little girl was angry and twisted her body to get out of his arms. Seeing this, Chun-Chi immediately hugged her tightly and didn't let her run away. But this hug was serious. After realizing that her freedom of life was restricted by her father, the little thing flipped out on the spot. "I'm not going. I'm not going. I want to go with my grandmother. My grandmother wants to go with us." As she shouted, her voice started to sound like she was about to cry. Following that, she burst into tears. Well, things were getting out of hand. The reason why the couple didn't tell the little girl in advance was that they were afraid that she would cry. But what would come, and they couldn't avoid it even if they wanted to. The reason why they wanted to leave was actually because of the same reason. Aunt Zhang had her own family, and their family was always outsiders. Naturally, they couldn't stay at Aunt Zhang's house for a long time. After all good things must come to an end. There were people coming and going at the ticket gate, and the little girl's sudden crying attracted a lot of attention. Chun-Chi had no choice but to take the little girl to a rest chair and let Aunt Zhang comfort her. This kind of thing had happened many times. It was normal for children to be clingy. So the family comforted the little girl one by one. Chun-Chi took out his phone and made a live video call with Aunt Zhang. He promised that he would bring her to Chengdu in the future, and only then did the little girl slowly stop crying. But she still didn't want to be separated from Aunt Zhang. She lay in her grandmother's arms without saying a word, as if she had been wronged. In the end, even the airport broadcast announced that they were boarding the plane. Only then did the little girl reluctantly wave goodbye to her grandmother with red eyes. "Grandmother, grandmother, we'll come to see you in the future." After watching the couple carrying the little girl gradually disappear into the distance, Aunt Zhang couldn't help but wipe the tears from the corners of her eyes. Although she wasn't her biological child, her love for Nian was very real. The plane took off. Perhaps it was because she had just cried, but the little girl didn't even have the interest to look at the clouds outside. She fell into a deep sleep. When she woke up again, the family had already returned to Zhonghai. The moment the cabin door opened, A salty sea breeze unique to coastal cities blew in. Unlike Chengdu and Shangjing, Zhonghai gave Chun-Shi the most unique feeling. But that feeling didn't come from the city itself, but from the people standing next to him at this moment. Chun-Shi carried the little girl. The moment he walked out of the gangway, he couldn't help but hold Qin Ruoying's hand. Zhonghai, we're back. Chapter 267. As soon as the family got off the plane and walked into the terminal, it began to drizzle. Just a moment ago, the sky was clear, but now it suddenly became drizzling. And this sudden spring rain seemed to be a ceremony to welcome the return of their family. Perhaps it was because she had slept on the plane, so when the little guy got off the plane, his lively and energetic appearance came back. Therefore, the little thing did not ask Chun-Shi to hold her. Instead, she jumped and ran in the corridor with her short legs. Seeing her excited look, the couple quickly followed behind her, hand in hand. If they ignored the little girl in front of them, the two of them now looked like a couple who came to Zhonghai for their honeymoon. It was impossible to tell that they were an old couple with a 5-year-old child. The little girl ran and jumped. After running for a while, she made a sharp turn and directly lay in front of the floor-to-ceiling window of the terminal. Then, she looked at the planes in front of her and said excitedly, "Papa, look, that plane is running." Chun-Shi came to the little girl's side. After touching her head with a smile, he put his hand on her back and pushed her out step by step. While walking, Chun-Shi asked with a smile, "See, didn't you just get on the plane? How do you feel?" The little thing seemed to like being pushed by her father, so she leaned back and did not fall down because of the support of Chun-Shi's palm. Then, she lay on Chun-Shi's palm. Then, under the push of Chun-Shi, like a master, she slowly walked forward with her short legs. "I like it. I like to fly." Looking at the bright smile on the little girl's face, Chun-Shi could not help but look at Qin Ruoying and smile. This child is so likable. The airport was so big that it took more than 10 minutes to walk out of the station. Even though there was a sidewalk elevator, the little thing was still tired of standing. So she turned around and raised her hands to Chen-Shi. Without needing her to say anything, Chen-Shi immediately squatted down and then hugged her in his arms. The higher one stood, the further one could see. Therefore, when she sat in Chen-Shi's arms, she pointed to exit 3 and asked in confusion, "Papa, what are they doing?" Chen-Shi looked in the direction the little fellow was pointing and saw 2 rows of burly men in black suits standing in front of the gate of the number 3 exit. That murderous aura was like that of a gang welcoming their boss home at the entrance of a prison. "He should be here to pick me up." "What's that?" "Let me give you an example. Let's say you take a plane to Chengdu alone. Grandma is afraid that you won't be able to find your way, so she comes to the airport to pick you up in advance. This is called picking you up." Oh. The little fellow nodded as if she understood. Then, she asked doubtfully, "Then who's coming to pick us up today?" "We don't need anyone to pick us up because we're going home now, not to Grandma's." Hearing this, the little fellow pouted and seemed to want to ask something, but Chun-Shi pinched her little face and decisively stopped this topic. Nowadays, stars like to pose for photos at the airport. As the fashion capital of Wuxia, there were stars coming to Zhonghai Airport to pose for photos every day. This also led to many fans waiting at the airport for a long time, just to take a photo with their favorite stars. At least 20 or 30 men in suits stood at the number 3 exit. There was a murderous aura there, which naturally made ordinary people dare not approach. Therefore, even though the other exits were about to be lined up, the number 3 exit was still a scene of sparrows. This abnormal situation also attracted the attention of a large number of professional fans. Although they did not dare to approach, they still carefully surrounded the number 3 exit with their mobile phones, wanting to see which big shot was coming. Chun-Shi's family was not people who liked to join in the fun, so after getting off the escalator, Chun-Shi and Qin Ruoying directly turned a corner and walked to the number 4 exit in front of them. At this moment, a voice suddenly sounded from behind them. "Mr. Chun, you're back." Chun-Shi looked back and saw Su Wei with an old face running toward him with great enthusiasm. "Mr. Su, what are you doing?" "Hey, I just got off the plane and saw you, so I wanted to come over and say hello. After all, you're my savior. Oh, okay. I've said hello, you can go do your thing. After that, She held the little fellow in one hand and Qin Ruoying in the other and prepared to leave. When Sui saw his posture, he suddenly became anxious, so he quickly ran to him and continued to say, Mr. Chun, you see, this is fate. You haven't called a taxi yet, right? Why don't you let me give you a ride? While speaking, Su Wei bowed to Chun Shi and made an inviting gesture. Chun Shi stopped, but he did not look at Su Wei. Instead, he turned his head and looked behind him. Ning Zhonghua was standing not far behind him. After going through thick and thin together, these two brothers had actually become sworn brothers. After Ning Zhonghua saw Chun Shi turn around, he immediately ran over, then smiled at Chun Shi and said, Mr. Chun, long time no see. Chun Shi did not speak. Ning Zhonghua and Su Wei looked at each other quietly. Then, Ning Zhonghua reluctantly continued to smile and said, I came to pick up old Su, but I didn't expect to meet you here. If it's convenient, why don't we give you a ride? What do you think? Chun Shi looked at the two of them calmly, then turned his head to look at Qin Ruoying. When he saw Qin Ruoying nod gently, Chun Shi replied, Okay, let's go. I'll give you a ride today. That's great. Mr. Chun, this way please. Su Wei jumped up excitedly on the spot. He stretched out his left hand and bowed slightly at the same time, like a greeter welcoming an important guest. He quickly walked in front to lead the way for Chun Shi. Wasn't the direction he was heading to exit 3? Su Wei led Chun Shi's family to exit 3. At this time, 2 rows of big men in suits immediately bent down and bowed to Chun Shi's family. At the same time, they shouted in unison, Mr. Chun, hello. 20 to 30 big men in suits bowed in unison and shouted loudly. Almost instantly, they shocked the entire terminal and attracted the attention of the surrounding crowd. This scene, Chun Shi didn't need to think to know that Ning Zhonghua and Su Wei had found out through their friends that he was going to fly back to Zhonghai, so they deliberately arranged such a show. The crowd was excited. After all, this was even more grand than when a celebrity made an appearance. Countless professional fans took out their phones and were ready to take photos. However, after the big men in suits bowed, they turned around and looked at the surrounding crowd, then stepped forward to stop them from taking photos. Chun Shi frowned slightly, but he did not say anything. However, the little girl in his arms was excited. She was a child, so she always liked excitement. This kind of treatment really made her very excited. So she raised her small hand and waved to the surrounding crowd with a big laugh. Chapter 268. Ning Zhonghua and Su Wei were obviously treating them with the highest standards. Therefore, when Chun Shi and his family walked out of Terminal 3 with Su Wei, the little girl was immediately attracted by the yellow Bentley in front of her. Papa, this car is so long. It was no wonder that she was surprised. After all, the common 3-compartment cars on the streets were generally about 4.3 meters long, but the Mulsanne Grand in front of her was different. The length of the limousine was 6.57 meters, which was 2 meters longer than the average car. It naturally gave people a very shocking feeling from the side. The luxury car was extraordinary, so its price was naturally not trivial. The price of 35 million yuan was as high as a mansion driving on the road. Su Wei bought this car to receive important guests. After buying it, he had only used it a few times. Today, when he learned that Chun Shi was going back to Zhonghai, he immediately took out this treasure to please him. Of course, the price of this car was secondary. Tens of millions was just a drizzle for a tycoon of this level. The most important thing was that this car was limited to only 12 in the world, and there was only one in the entire Wuxia. Even if you had money, you couldn't buy it. Naturally, the price would increase. In order to win Chun Shi's favor, Su Wei used all of his tricks. He almost hung a banner at the entrance of the airport parking lot that said, Welcome Mr. Chun to Zhonghai. Su Wei had completely transformed into a concierge now. He respectfully opened the door for Chun Shi's family. After Chun Shi's family got in the car, he wanted to get in as well. However, at this time, Chun Shi, who was sitting in the car, glanced at him indifferently. Su Wei was very smart. He almost instantly understood what Chen Shi meant, so he quickly found a way out of this situation. He smiled and said, "Mr. Chun, I won't disturb you. I'll sit in the back." After that, he gave Ning Zhonghua a look, and he ran to the Mercedes-Benz S-Class in the back. Because Ning Zhonghua and Chun Shi knew each other earlier, compared to Su Wei, it was easier for Ning Zhonghua to talk to Chen Shi. However, there was an old saying, "Today is different from the past." After the two of them experienced a series of events, their attitude toward Chun Shi had naturally changed dramatically. It was a kind of respect from the bottom of their hearts, and it had nothing to do with age, experience, or social status. It was purely because Chun Shi was better than them. This alone was enough. With Ning Zhonggua's personality, he obviously wouldn't do something like this. However, after Su's suggestions, he finally nodded and agreed. After all, if he didn't agree, what should he do to continue to get closer to Chun? Beauty and money? Did Chun need? Therefore, sometimes it was very meaningful to put down one's face to flatter in front of the leader. As for those elegant people who thought they were virtuous and looked down on flattery, they actually fell into a misconception. They always thought that flatterers were incompetent people. In fact, flattery was a sign of high EQ, and it was also a common trait of successful people. After Su Wei left, Ning Zhonghua sat directly in the front passenger seat. In this luxury car, there was actually a partition between the front seat and the back seat. The back seat was completely a separate space, which was commonly known as the boss cabin. This was an extended version, and the back seat could sit 4 people, so it used a 4-seat design. Chun Shi and Qin Ruoying sat side by side, and the little girl climbed between the 2 seats opposite them. She seemed to be very interested in the layout of the car. From time to time, she would open and close the small table on the seat. She was having a lot of fun. At this time, Ning Zhonghua lowered the partition in the car, turned around and asked Chun Shi with a smile, "Mr. Chun, do you want to go home first, or do you want to eat?" It was not even 1 o'clock in the afternoon, which was just the time for lunch. Su Wei and Ning Zhonghua spent so much effort just to treat Chen Shi's family to a meal. Hearing this, Chun Shi immediately turned his head and looked at Qin Ruoying. It was all up to his wife. Seeing this, Qin Ruoying first looked at the tall terminal through the window, then asked the little girl, "Nian, are you hungry?" "I'm not hungry." The little girl was busy fiddling with the car refrigerator in the middle of the armrest, and she didn't even raise her head. After getting off the plane, she clamored for Chun Shi to buy her KFC. After eating a hamburger, she was naturally not hungry at all. Looking at the little girl who was tossing and turning in the opposite seat, Qin Ruoying thought for a moment, then suddenly smiled at Chun Shi and said, "It's still early. How about we go back to school?" Back to school? Chun Shi was stunned for a moment. He really didn't expect Qin Ruoying to want to go here after returning to Zhonghai. But after thinking about it, Chun Shi still understood Qin Ruoying's idea. So, he smiled and said to Ning Zhonghua, "President Ning to Zhonghai University, sorry to trouble you." Perhaps because he was in a good mood, Chun Shi's pleasant appearance at the moment made Ning Zhonghua feel flattered. He quickly replied happily, "Okay, Mr. Chun. Take a rest, we'll be there soon." Under the gray sky, a fleet of luxury cars drove from the airport to Zhonghai University. Because he didn't want to be too eye-catching, Chun Shi asked the fleet to stop on the street some distance away from the school gate. Then, he held the little girl in one hand and Qin Ruoying in the other, and the family of 3 slowly walked to the place that represented the beginning. Time flew by and the years flew by. What a blissful year, fleeting past. Time did not leave any mark on the couple's faces. They were still young, except that they no longer had the innocence of their school days. Everything seemed to be the same as before. The little girl lay on Chun Shi's shoulder and looked around. Her cute little appearance immediately attracted a lot of envious eyes. Ignoring the astonished gazes of the bystanders, the family of 3 leisurely walked on the forest path. That tree, that lake, that pavilion, that building, it seemed to be the same as it was 10 years ago. They wandered aimlessly around their alma mater. It was not until they came to the playground that she suddenly remembered the magnificent feat of covering the playground with roses. She would always remember that scene. In the sea of roses, Qin Ruoying, dressed in white, was like a beautiful butterfly. Under everyone's astonished eyes, she flew directly into his arms. That should be the most glorious moment of his life, right? Perhaps sensing the sudden smile on Shi's face, Qin Ruoying asked with a smile, "What's wrong? Did you think of something good?" Hearing this, Shi immediately squeezed her hand and asked with a smile, "Isn't it all because of you? Is it? Isn't it? Are you blaming me? How is that possible? I can't wait to do it again. TSK. That feeling, it's great. Look at how happy you are." The couple sat in the stands and showed their affection unscrupulously while the little guy jumped around them. A football game was being held on the playground. The little guy imitated the other spectators and shouted cheers from time to time. He looked very excited. After sitting for a while, she suddenly hugged Qin Ruoying's slender waist, then looked into her eyes and asked with a little confusion, "Ying, actually I have a question to ask you." What's the question? Why did you like me in the first place?" After hearing what he said, Qin Ruoying was stunned on the spot. She could not help but ask, "Why do you ask that?" Hearing this, she shook his head and sighed, "I don't think I'm good enough for you." Of course, this sentence was not referring to the current him, but to the past him. Therefore, she had always been very puzzled. What kind of luck did he have to be favored by the goddess? Could it be Qin Ruoying really had the ability to predict the future? Did she know that he had potential? Of course, Qin Ruoying did not have the ability to predict the future. Therefore, after hearing Shi's words, she could not help but smile. After reaching out and touching Shi's cheek, she said slightly mischievously, "Then you have to ask Yu Lao. Why did he put my red string on your hand? Then I have to go to Yu Lao's temple and burn incense to repay the vow. I have to thank him for giving me such a good wife." Fate was a kind of fate. The reason why the two of them were together was perhaps because fate had arranged for them to be together. And she obviously had not reached the level of being able to see through fate. You are as beautiful as a flower, and the years pass by like water. Answer is leisurely and self-pity in the boudoir. Turn in front of the peony fence, close to the lake and the mountain rock. Loosen the collar button with you, the width of the shirt, the tips of the sleeves are ruffled, and the teeth are stained. Wait for you to endure and sleep tenderly for a while. It was that place where they had met before. Look at each other, it was difficult to say anything to each other. Chapter 269. March was rainy. In Zhonghai, a first-tier bustling city, one naturally could not feel the leisure of a small city in the south. The drizzling March seemed to have covered Zhonghai with a thin layer of gauze. The couple sat quietly in the stands of the sports field. In front of them was the football field brimming with youthful sweat, but behind them was the old building of the Republic of China. With such a profound background, it seemed to have covered their backs with a hint of loneliness and otherworldly charm. The hazy artistic conception of the misty Jiangnan could probably only be experienced in this beautiful campus. The little fellow could not feel the tranquil and distant artistic conception. Instead, she was completely attracted by the lively football game on the field. Although she did not even understand the rules of the football game, as long as the audience began to cheer, she would immediately jump up and cheer with everyone. At this time, someone shouted, "And Qianqian is here." This sentence was like a stone thrown into the lake, immediately splashing circles of ripples. After hearing this sentence, many of the audience immediately stood up and ran out of the sports field. The players on the field also heard the movement. This was not an official game, but a training game for the school's football team. Therefore, several of the team members stopped on the spot. After looking around, they did not even bother with the game and directly ran out of the sports field with the crowd. Seeing that the lively sports field suddenly became empty, the little fellow ran to Shi and asked doubtfully, "Papa, why did they leave?" Looking at the little fellow's unsatisfied look, She immediately smiled and pulled her into his arms. Then he fooled her. They are students, of course they are going to class. Nian, do you still remember what teacher Wang taught you before? What should you do after hearing the bell? She had been to kindergarten before and naturally knew the rules of the kindergarten. So she immediately laughed and replied, I remember. I want to go to the classroom. Smart. You see, your brothers and sisters have all gone to class. Do you want to go to class? Hearing this, the little fellow immediately tilted her head and pondered. After all, there were so many children in the kindergarten. In addition to teaching them singing and drawing, the teachers would also organize them to play games together. In fact, it was quite fun. But if she went to kindergarten, she wouldn't be able to stay by her parents' side all day. Therefore, after serious consideration, the little thing shook its head and said with obvious hesitation, I don't want to go. When she saw her reaction, he immediately knew what was going on. Looking at this situation, if he were to guide her a little after returning to Shangjing, this child would probably still be willing to go to kindergarten. Because many students had left, the field had become much quieter. Without any excitement to watch, this little thing obviously couldn't sit still. Therefore, she picked up the little fellow and held Qin Ruoying's hand as they wandered around the school again. There were 3 campuses in Zhonghai University. They were currently at the headquarters, which was the old campus. However, even though the old campus was located in the city, it covered a large area. It was more than 3,000 mu, which was more than 2 million square meters. Therefore, it would take at least 1 or 2 hours for the couple to explore the entire Zhonghai University. Anyway, it was still early, and they had nothing to do, so they casually strolled around the campus. They didn't take the main road, but chose a small path in the forest. The rain was so light that they didn't even need to use an umbrella, but it was long-lasting. A few drops would fall from time to time, so it still wet the stone path along the way. Walking on such a path, in a trance, the deep and distant mood came back. He still remembered that 10 years ago, they also walked side by side on this path. Even if there were no words along the way, it didn't prevent them from knocking on each other's hearts. Just like the moral scriptures said, the big voice is silent, the elephant is invisible, and great love is speechless. The family of 3 strolled slowly along the path. After passing through the forest path and walking around the lake, they arrived at the teaching building area. The school was supposed to be a quiet place, but now it was very lively. They didn't know what happened, but many students crowded in the open space outside the teaching building, blocking the surrounding roads. This lively scene naturally attracted the little fellow's attention. Papa, what are they looking at? I want to see it too. Under the little fellow's constant shouting, she had to lift her up high, and then tried to squeeze in the direction of the crowd. Although most of the vision was blocked by the wall of people, she listened for a while and understood what was going on here. Turned out that there was a film crew here. These days, filming was not a rare thing. The main reason why there was such a big commotion was mainly because of the female lead of this film. The female lead was called Enai Chanqian, and she was a popular female star recently. Her popularity was already very high, and she graduated from Zhonghai University, so it was a home field for her. Naturally, the junior brothers and sisters came to support her, which was why there was such a big commotion. Papa, they're shooting a movie. Shooting a movie. The little fellow also heard the discussion around her. When the 3 words, shooting a movie, drilled into her ears, the little fellow suddenly sat on Chan's shoulder, as if she had been injected with stimulants. I want to see a movie. Papa, go over a little. I can't see. I can't see. Although there were many people around, the discussion was not very loud. After all, everyone knew that the sound of the scene was recorded in a movie, so when they spoke, they deliberately lowered their voices. After the little guy made such a ruckus at the top of his voice, it immediately attracted the attention of many people. The students standing in front turned around to look at the little fellow, and then they all moved to the sides, making a path for them in the impenetrable crowd. Respecting the old and loving the young was a traditional Chinese virtue, which was most easily reflected in the hot-blooded college students. Thank you. Chun she squeezed through the passageway with the little girl in her arms and thanked the students along the way. At this time, Qin Ruoying whispered a few words to the little fellow. It was not right to shout like this in public. It was very rude, and it showed that she had no family education. The little fellow was very sensible. So after listening to her mother's words, she seemed to understand that her behavior just now was a little rude. So she copied Chen Shi and kept thanking the students on both sides. Thank you, brother. Thank you, sister. I'm sorry. After saying that, the little fellow was a little embarrassed and stuck out her little tongue. That cute little look made a female student next to her couldn't help but praise. Sister, your daughter is so cute. Thank you. Qin Ruoying smiled and nodded. After reaching out and pinching the little fellow's little face, she followed Chen Shi to the front of the crowd. When they came to the front row, they finally saw the appearance of the big star. She was really beautiful, probably because they were shooting a youth campus drama. The female lead was dressed as a student and looked very pure. With the help of the makeup artist, she looked about the same age as the surrounding students. She was completely a young girl in her early 20s. However, when Chen Shi saw the appearance of the female star, he immediately couldn't help shaking his head and laughing. Chapter 270. Anai Qinyu had changed her name to Anai Qianqian. Last year, due to the broadcast of a phenomenal web drama, she became popular all over the internet. Coupled with the company's support and various resources, she was successfully sent to several of the most popular variety shows. She established a youthful and lovely persona in front of the audience and attracted a large number of fans. Because of this, Anai Qianqian became one of the most popular young actresses and successfully entered the ranks of A-list actresses. Times were developing faster and faster, and so was the entertainment industry. Just like what Andy Zai sang in 17: I shamelessly participated in the challenge when I was 17. Even stars have training classes. It's so refreshing in just 1 year. Andy Zai joined the wireless training class in 1981 and started as a film and television actor. Under the guidance of brother Fa, he started as an extra and entered the music industry in 1986. It wasn't until the early 1990s that he finally gained a place in the music industry with the song, If You Were My Legend. After that, in addition to creating a series of iconic characters on the screen, he also released a number of hit singles such as Thank You for Your Love, Wang Qing Shui, and other classic love songs. Finally, he was promoted to the throne of the 4 heavenly kings by the Hong Kong media. At this time, Andy Zai had been in the music industry for more than a decade. Almost all of the stars in that era were versatile artists who could act and sing. Many of them were even radio hosts. But now, from the 18th tier to the A-list, it might only take one movie or TV series. Some of them didn't even know how to act. They only needed to be good-looking and participate in a few variety shows to become popular all over the country. This also created a strange phenomenon. Nowadays, stars become popular quickly, but they also become popular very quickly. A few years ago, the little fresh meat that was in the headlines almost every day was forgotten in just 2 or 3 years. Anai Qianqian knew the cruelty of the entertainment industry. Since she finally became popular, she naturally wanted to seize this opportunity. Therefore, she tried her best to maintain her popularity. Therefore, she suggested to the director that the shooting location be her alma mater. She also wanted to use this opportunity to make another wave of headlines. No matter what, Zhonghai University was still one of the top 10 universities in the country. Anai Qianqian's academic qualifications allowed her to beat the other illiterates in the entertainment industry, earning her the title of Goddess of Academic Qualifications. The reason why she was able to call out Anai Qianqian's real name was because this little girl who appeared to be in her early 20s was actually an old auntie from the same batch as them. For an idol artist who relied on her looks and personality to attract fans, age was obviously a scary thing. After all, Qin Ruoying, who was the same age as her, was already a mother of a 5-year-old child. On the other hand, Anai Qianqian still had to play the role of a pure and lovely girl in front of the public. This kind of situation where his appearance did not match his actual age was really suspicious, Would she show symptoms of schizophrenia? Because of the little girl's protective talisman, the students forcibly made room for the family of 3 in the front row. After hearing Chun Shi's words, Qin Ruoying immediately looked in the direction that Chun Shi was pointing at. It's really her, and I Chinyu. She's a big star now? And I Chanqian and Qin Ruoying were students of the same major, so they usually saw each other frequently. Although their relationship was not considered close, after so many years after graduation, suddenly meeting an old classmate of hers naturally gave people a sense of closeness. N.I. Chanqian had only entered the entertainment industry after graduating from university. She could be considered to be one of those talented people. After acting in a web drama, her acting skills had improved rapidly. Now that she was acting in a movie, no one could find any fault with her. This scene was very simple. It was a scene where the male and female lead reunited in university. After all, it was just a youth school movie, so the requirements for acting skills were not high. As long as the performance was natural, it was fine. Therefore, after 2 takes, the director shouted through the loudspeaker, "Cut! Very good, this scene is done. Young Master Ting, change your clothes and prepare for the next scene. Chanqian, you've finished filming today. Go back and have a good rest. We'll continue tomorrow." Okay, director. After hearing the director's words, N.I. Chanqian smiled politely. Seeing that the crew was busy rearranging the set, someone hiding in the crowd suddenly shouted, "N.I. Chanqian, I love you." This sentence instantly ignited the enthusiasm of the surrounding students. Everyone chimed in one after another. "Senior, you're so beautiful. I love you. Senior, give me an autograph. Senior Chanqian, I want to give birth to your children." Looking at the lively scene, if it were not for the staff stopping them, this group of enthusiastic students would have rushed up to N.I. Chanqian to ask for an autograph. "Thank you, everyone. Thank you, my cute junior brothers and sisters." Seeing that everyone was so enthusiastic, N.I. Chanqian turned around and bowed to the surrounding crowd. When she bowed for the 3rd time, N.I. Chanqian finally found a familiar figure in the crowd. Then, N.I. Chanqian was stunned. With Chun Shi's eyesight, he immediately noticed the strange look that flashed across N.I. Chanqian's eyes. However, he thought that N.I. Chanqian was just surprised to see an old classmate, so he did not take it to heart. N.I. Chanqian was indeed an actress. After the surprise flashed across her face, she immediately put on a warm smile and walked toward the direction of the family of 3. The surrounding students thought that she was coming over to give an autograph, so they instantly became excited. "Senior, I have a pen. Give me an autograph. Please give me an autograph. Senior, I love you." N.I. Chanqian kept waving at the surrounding students, but she did not have any intention of giving them an autograph. After arriving in front of Qin Ruoying, N.I. Chanqian lifted the cordon set by the crew and smiled at Qin Ruoying. "Long time no see." Qin Ruoying did not expect N.I. Chanqian to recognize her as an old classmate, so she was stunned for a moment before she replied with a smile, "Long time no see." As the crowd was too excited, after a simple greeting, N.I. Chanqian gestured for Chun Shi's family to follow her in. Seeing this, the couple could not help but look at each other. N.I. Chanqian then led them through the cordon and followed her to the temporary resting area set up by the crew. There were originally a few crew members resting in the resting area, but when they saw N.I. Chanqian coming over, they very consciously retreated. After inviting Chun Shi's family to take a seat, N.I. Chanqian then looked at the little girl in Chun Shi's arms and asked, "Is this your daughter? How old is she?" "Almost 5 years old." Qin Ruoying replied politely, then turned to the little girl and said, "Nian Nian, greet auntie." Hearing this, the little girl immediately greeted N.I. Chanqian sweetly, "Auntie, good girl." After a few simple pleasantries, the 2 of them fell silent. They did not seem to know what to talk about with each other. After all, the 2 of them were not very close when they were in university. They could not even be considered friends. They were probably classmates who would greet each other when they met on the road. The reason why Qin Ruoying felt that N.I. Chanqian was very close to her was because they had been classmates for a long time. Chen Shi and Qin Ruoying were originally not in the same major, so naturally, he and Anai Qianqian were even more distant. Therefore, Chen Shi simply sat beside the little girl and played with her, leaving the space for them to catch up. Anai Qianqian was silent for a while. Then, as if she thought of something, she suddenly smiled and said, "Ying, do you mind if I call you that?" "I don't mind. Do you know? When I first saw you, a very popular online song suddenly popped up in my head." What song?" "School Bell." Then, Anai Qianqian softly hummed the song. "They all say she is a flower, flowers are not as good as her. They all say she is a dream, how many people have pursued her. The heartless years like water, slowly painted in the books. Ask the fleeting clouds, how is our school bell? Who plays the guitar and wants to be the school bell? Who will be the school bell? So love is like a blackboard eraser." Chapter 271. Anai Qianqian simply hummed a few words. Her voice was very pleasant, and it seemed like she had learned to sing before. Therefore, such a seemingly vulgar online song had a different flavor under her interpretation. Looking at Qin Ruoying's puzzled expression, Anai Qianqian suddenly smiled and said, "Ying, 10 years have passed and you're even prettier than before. You're indeed worthy of being the campus belle of our batch." Qin Ruoying smiled and shook her head when she heard that. She turned to look at the little girl in Chen Shi's arms and replied, "I can't afford to be called that. You, on the other hand, are now a big star and the juniors outside are all your fans." Haha. Anai Qianqian looked at the crowd outside the resting area and a faint smile flashed across her face. Ever since she became popular, the feeling of being the center of attention had always lingered around her. From the initial discomfort to the current calmness, Anai Qianqian had a very rich psychological experience. She was now like a goddess standing on the clouds. This gave Anai Qianqian a lot of confidence. For example, when she faced the goddess in front of her, who once made her feel ashamed, Anai Qianqian could not help but feel pity for her. With Qin Ruoying's beauty, Anai Qianqian would not be surprised if she became the second sister Milk Tea. However, she still married the poor guy that everyone looked down on and even gave birth to a daughter for him. Although their family seemed to be very happy now, such an ordinary life was definitely not what Anai Qianqian wanted. What a pity. Anai Qianqian felt pity for Qin Ruoying because she had been in the entertainment industry for many years and had a pair of discerning eyes. Just like Tang Wei's character in When Beijing Meets Seattle 2, Anai Qianqian could easily determine the total value of Qin Ruoying's clothes with just a casual glance. Qin Ruoying didn't wear any jewelry or watches. Although the simple gray coat looked like it was custom-made, it still couldn't hide the rough workmanship of the coat itself. A conservative estimate was that she was only worth 500 yuan from head to toe. Looking at Chen Shi and the little girl, they were also dressed in cheap clothes. If a man was really capable, he would obviously not mistreat his wife and daughter. Therefore, Anai Qianqian came to a conclusion. The family of 3 in front of her was not very rich and might even be a little short of money. As the saying went, a woman should be raised well. Although Qin Ruoying still looked glamorous now, what would happen in a few years? Women needed maintenance and maintenance needed money. Perhaps she would only truly understand these principles when she grew old and exhausted the beauty bestowed upon her by the heavens. In order to avoid looking down on others, Anai Qianqian also asked about Chen Shi and Qin Ruoying's current work situation during the chat. When she found out that the husband and wife were running a tea house together, her guess was immediately confirmed. This caused Anai Qianqian to feel bored to death. After all, they were not from the same world. No matter how outstanding they were when they were students, once they chose the wrong path after graduation, wouldn't the end result be to become ordinary? Anai Qianqian was a popular actress. Even if she found out about Qin Ruoying's background during the conversation, her face did not show a trace of contempt. After the two chatted for a while, Anai Qianqian apologetically mentioned that she had to rush to a job later. Seeing this, Qin Ruoying immediately nodded to express her understanding. Then, the reunion ended in a happy atmosphere. Before leaving, Ni Qianqian took the initiative to add Qin Ruoying's WeChat and warmly said that they could keep in touch in the future. The reason why she did this was because she felt that Qin Ruoying still had room to recover. People would always grow up. Under her influence, perhaps Qin Ruoying would suddenly come around one day. With Qin Ruoying's beauty, figure, and unique temperament, as long as she nodded, Ni Qianqian could definitely introduce her to an ideal family. Maybe they could even be good sisters in the future? Ni Qianqian smiled as she sent Qi's family out of the cordon. After waving goodbye to them, she turned around and walked to the set. From the beginning to the end, she did not put on any airs in front of the family of three. The couple walked out of the crowd under the envious eyes of the fans. After walking for a while, Qin Ruoying suddenly asked thoughtfully, what do you think of Ni Qianqian? Hearing this, she smiled and replied, he's an adult. What do you mean? Isn't there a popular saying now? Peppa Pig gets a tattoo and applause for society. Ni Qianqian is a standard society person. I don't quite understand what you mean. When she saw Qin Ruoying's confused face, he could not help but reach out and hug her slender waist. He smiled and said, if you don't understand, then don't think too much. Let's go, we don't belong to the same world. The couple continued to stroll around the campus. It wasn't until the little girl was a little bored and wanted to go home to watch cartoons that they walked back in the direction of the school gate. Just as they were about to walk out of the school gate, a Toyota Elfa, commonly known as a celebrity nanny van, drove past them discreetly. When the assistant sitting in the passenger seat saw Qi's family, she could not help but turn around and remind Ni Qianqian. Qianqian, your old classmates are still there. Should we give them a ride? Ni Qianqian was sitting in the back with a face mask on. When she heard the assistant's words, she turned her head sideways and glanced out the window. Then, she said indifferently, no need, let's just go. Okay. She had already cast the bait. As for whether the fish would take the bait or not, it was up to the fish. Ni Qianqian was half lying on the seat confidently. She even began to look forward to the moment when Qin Ruoying would chat with her on WeChat. However, when Ni Qianqian was resting with her face mask on, the assistant's voice sounded again. Sister Qianqian, look, that person seems to be CEO Su from Weisheng Pharmaceutical. Hey, the one next to him should be CEO Ning from China Ocean Corporation, right? Why are they here? As a celebrity assistant, there were actually a lot of things to learn. For example, she had to at least know some business moguls. What were business moguls to celebrities? They were scripts. They were resources. They were everything. To sum it up in two simple and crude words, that was sugar daddy. As long as the sugar daddy was strong enough, even an internet celebrity could be smashed by a rich businessman. Therefore, how to curry favor with the rich had become a compulsory course for celebrities. Of course, this did not mean that she had to sleep with them. Businessmen were after profits. A movie was worth hundreds of millions of investment. Did she really think that she could become the female lead just by sleeping with the financier? How could it be that simple? Businessmen would definitely not do a losing business. It was not easy to get a rich businessman to invest in her new movie. It was obviously a very effective way to make her presence known in front of a rich businessman. Therefore, Ni Qianqian immediately sat up from the chair. After making sure that she was not mistaken, she pulled off the mask on her face and quickly shouted to her assistant, "Where's my bag? Quick! Quick! Let me touch up my makeup." The minivan was parked in a parking space not far from the school gate. Then, Ni Qianqian started to touch up her makeup in the car. But just as she was in a hurry, something happened that left her flabbergasted. The two top business moguls in Zhonghai were like concierge at this moment. They quickly ran to Qi's family, bowed and asked for instructions, and escorted Qi's family to the Bentley Grand limousine. At this moment, Ni Qianqian was completely stunned. An indescribable feeling suddenly surged from her heart, and immediately, her face became rosy like a ripe rose. And this feeling of blushing, she had not experienced this for many years. The assistant saw that Ni Qianqian was still in a daze, so she could not help but remind her. "Sister Qianqian, They seem to be leaving. Hearing this, Ai Qianqian suddenly trembled as if she had been electrocuted. Although this little thing didn't even know what the local dishes were, she still nodded quickly like a chicken pecking rice. Seeing that the little girl agreed, Ning Zhonghua looked at the couple behind him and said with a smile, "Mr. Chen, Mrs. Chen, I wonder if this local dish is to your liking?" Hearing this, she was not polite at all. After nodding with a smile, he replied, "We are not picky about food. You can arrange it as you see fit." He was not a reclusive master. Ning Zhonghua and Su Wei had flattered him like this. If he did not give them face, it would indeed be a bit too unreasonable. "That's great. I happen to know a local chef. His braised lion's head in brown sauce was the champion of a cooking competition. I think this child will definitely like it." Then, the luxury motorcade headed by Bentley and Mercedes-Benz S-Class drove to Dianjiang Avenue. After arriving at the destination, she found that Ning Zhonghua and Su Wei had already arranged everything. Tonight's dinner was not at a restaurant, but on a yacht. "Papa, look! So many boats." After the little girl came to the dock, she pointed at the yachts outside the dock and shouted excitedly. Although she had been on a luxury cruise ship, she still couldn't figure out the difference between a big ship and a small ship, so she could only use a small ship to call a yacht. What was a yacht? Its positioning was not a means of transportation, but a high-end durable consumer product for water supply and entertainment. What did Ning Zhonghua do? He was the former chairman of the Ocean Voyage Group and the largest shareholder of the Ocean Voyage Group. The cruise ship that Fang Lei used when she got married was rented from the Ocean Voyage Group. Therefore, the large luxury business boat docked at the dock was obviously the place Ning Zhonghua had arranged for this dinner. It could be seen that, in order to flatter this person, he and Su Wei had racked their brains. The reason why they chose to eat on the yacht was actually very particular. Once the yacht left the dock, it would become an absolutely enclosed space. In this environment, it was naturally easier to close the distance between people. Don't you see how many secret transactions that can't see the light of day were negotiated on the yacht? For Ning Zhonggua's painstaking arrangement, the couple didn't have much reaction, but the little girl was excited. After all, compared to the cruise ship, the boat in front of her made her feel the charm of the sea more. So, after boarding the boat, she jumped up and down excitedly in the boat. The yacht itself was synonymous with high quality, and the decoration in the cabin was naturally extremely exquisite and luxurious. The couple went straight to the top of the yacht under the leadership of Su Wei and Ning Zhonghua. Chapter 273. As the saying goes, one who is unaccountably solicitous is hiding evil intentions. Ning Zhonghua and Su Wei spent so much effort to come up with so many tricks. Obviously, they didn't just want to make their presence known in front of Chun Shi. And this kind of flattery, for these two business moguls who were over 100 years old, was really a different experience. After all, with their status, even the mayor of Zhonghai had to give them some face. When money and power were no longer life goals, then health and longevity were obviously their last pursuit. Therefore, she didn't even need to think to know what the two of them wanted from her. Seeing that the little guy was so happy today, she gave them a chance to speak. The moment Shi's voice fell, even with Ning Zhonggua's shrewdness, he still couldn't help but have a flash of joy on his face. Even Ning Zhonghua lost his composure, not to mention Su Wei. Overjoyed, Su Wei's face immediately showed a harmless smile. That smile also made him look like a farmer on the ridge of the fields. Where was his usual decisiveness and decisiveness of a CEO? The two quietly looked at each other. Then, Ning Zhonghua coughed twice and put on a slightly awkward expression as he said to Chen Shi, "Mr. Chan, actually, it's like this, life is not like before. Alcohol, women, avarice, and anger are the most hurtful. When a person's body is weak, it is easy to get all kinds of diseases. Only when you get sick will you realize the importance of health." Sure enough, it was for the energy pill. She leaned on the railing and looked at Ning Zhonghua quietly. Under his gaze, Ning Zhonghua seemed to be under a huge pressure. In just a short while, beads of sweat appeared on his forehead. He was like a primary school student who made a mistake. His voice became smaller and smaller. In the end, Ning Zhonghua couldn't help but lower his head. He didn't dare to look at Chun-Shi again. Ever since the incident last time, the two of us have been following your orders and not revealing any information about you. We told the public that the expert who made the Yamasaro had passed away, but what we didn't expect was that the rumor would become more and more ridiculous as it spread. Now, as long as someone has a difficult illness, they will come to us for help. We don't know how many people we have offended because of this. While Ning Zhonghua was explaining his difficulties in a low voice, the little fellow on the second deck suddenly raised her small head and shouted at Chun-Shi, who was standing on the third deck, "Papa, there is a sofa here. Come and sit down." As she spoke, she excitedly patted the deck sofa beside her. The sofa was soft, even more comfortable than lying on a bed. Coupled with the afterglow of the setting sun and the gentle caress of the sea breeze, this young fellow had learned to enjoy the beauty of nature. "Okay. Dad will come down to accompany you." Chun-Shi turned around and replied to the little fellow. Seeing this, Ning Zhonghua immediately swallowed back his unfinished words, and then stood aside solemnly without saying a word. Chun-Shi glanced at him, but didn't say a word. She walked straight to the spiral staircase on the side. Seeing this, Ning Zhonghua and Su Wei couldn't help but have a very complicated expression on their faces. It's over. Both of them knew their limits. Seeing that Chun-Shi didn't say anything, they naturally wouldn't ask for trouble on this topic. Then, dinner began in a happy atmosphere. The yacht meandered along the Dian River. The little fellow chewed on the ribs and looked at the beautiful scenery brought by the lights on both sides of the river. She couldn't help but murmur, "Papa, it's so beautiful outside. Do you like it?" "I like it." "Then Uncle will treat you to a big meal and take you to see such beautiful scenery. Shouldn't you thank Uncle properly?" Hearing this, the little fellow immediately wiped the oil stains on her mouth with her hand, and then smiled sweetly at Ning Zhonghua and Su Wei. "Thank you, Uncle Ning." "Thank you, Uncle Su." "Hee Nyen, if you like, you can come and play with Uncle at any time. Uncle will take you to have a good time in Zhonghai. How about it?" "Okay. Thank you, Uncle. This child is really likable. Mr. Chan is so lucky." After dinner, Ning Zhonghua and Su Wei sent Chun-Shi's family back to the Kangju community. As for the elixir, the two of them didn't dare to mention it again. After the little fellow politely said goodbye to the two uncles, the family of three turned around and walked to the Kangju community. When they brought the little girl to the entrance of the neighborhood, the couple stopped in their tracks at the same time. At this moment, the two of them couldn't help but have mixed feelings in their hearts. After all, this was the home that the two of them built together. Although this home was simple, it carried too many things. The sky, the breeze, the air, the temperature, the fragrance at that time, that feeling, the memories that were stagnant like film, you and me at that time. When the breeze blew, those things that couldn't be taken away were all called the past. Under the dim yellow light, the couple's shadows were very long. Perhaps because of the emotions in her heart, Qin Ruoying couldn't help but have tears in her eyes. And just as the couple looked at each other in silence and reminisced about the past, a clear and crisp voice sounded very untimely. "Mama, let's go home. We're going home." As she spoke, the little fellow who spoiled the mood sat in Chun-Shi's arms and reached out to Qin Ruoying. She wanted to go into her mother's arms. After all, for this little fellow, her mother seemed to have left for a longer time. Qin Ruoying quietly wiped the tears from the corners of her eyes, and then smiled as she took the little fellow from Chun-Shi's arms. Accompanied by Nyenyen's somewhat disturbing shouts, they finally returned home. Perhaps it was the same feeling as Chun-Shi felt when he first returned. When Qin Ruoying walked into the room and saw the familiar furnishings in the house, she couldn't help but burst into tears like a broken dam. 5 years. It was indeed too long. After entering the room, the little fellow ran straight to the TV. After skillfully turning on the TV, she looked back at the door. When she saw her father and mother hugging each other excitedly, She immediately tilted her head and asked in confusion, "Papa? What's wrong with Mama?" Hearing this, Qin Ruoying gently pushed Changxi away and wiped the tears on her face. Seeing that she was still adjusting her mood, Changxi turned back and said to the little fellow, "Sand got into Mama's eyes. Papa is blowing it for her." "Oh." The little fellow nodded as if she understood, and then shouted to Qin Ruoying, "Mama, watch cartoons with me." As she spoke, she patted the sofa beside her and motioned Qin Ruoying to come and sit down. "Okay, we'll watch with you." Qin Ruoying wiped the tears from the corners of her eyes, and then pulled Changxi to the little fellow's side. The family of three huddled together on the old sofa. Chapter 275, World Photography Competition Exhibition. This award was very prestigious and professional, but it was too professional. Therefore, when the winners of the competition were announced, it didn't cause much of a stir on the internet. After all, compared to breaking news like a celebrity's infidelity, professional news was indeed too niche. Lin Xian said that Changxi and his wife were now online because of this photo titled Lovers, which really amazed many photography enthusiasts and insiders. Photography was the same as painting. It was to show static beauty to the world. But the difference between photography and painting was that painting could be created at will, while photography honestly recorded everything that happened at the time. The scenes shown in the photos were also scenes that had once appeared in this world. The selection method of the photography award was nothing more than the evaluation of the theme, scene, composition, exposure, tone, clarity, and several other aspects. The reason why this photo won first place in the professional portrait category was entirely because the couple in the photo was too dazzling. Just like a war photographer taking photos of refugees on the battlefield, the subject matter itself was a bonus. It was a kind of luck to be able to meet such an outstanding model in the vast sea of people. But the art of photography sometimes really did require a certain amount of luck. Weren't many world-famous classic photos captured by photographers by chance? Therefore, although the photographer named Sun Yuanyuan's skills were mediocre, she still managed to stand out from the rest of the entries and become a celebrity in the circle. And now, wasn't this award-winning photo on display at London's Somerset Palace? After Changxi showed the news he found on the internet to Qin Ruoying, the couple didn't know whether to laugh or cry. It seemed that they had to pay more attention to protecting their portrait rights in the future. They didn't want to be online, so this kind of feeling of putting their photos on the internet for the world to see, it was a bit strange. However, since they had already given it, it was too late for regrets. Therefore, the couple could only adjust their mood and completely forget about this matter. Later, the couple accompanied the little girl to watch cartoons for a while, and then went out to find Lin Xian to catch up. The lunch location was chosen by Lin Xian. It was a Western restaurant with a good reputation and was very friendly. The restaurant's location was good. It was on the edge of the Dianjiang River. Sitting in the outdoor seats outside the restaurant, one could overlook the entire Dianjiang River. Perhaps it was because it was close to the business district, so when Changxi's family arrived at the restaurant, there were already many business people in formal attire sitting there. Chapter 276, Engagement. After Lin Xian's voice fell, even Chen Shi, who was next to her, could not help but turn his head to look at her. It had only been about half a year since the last time they parted at the dock. Who would have thought that Lin Xian was going to get engaged? Who is it? Do I know him? Qin Ruoying threw out a series of questions, but Lin Xian smiled and shook her head after listening. She responded, "You don't know him." At this time, she could not help but interrupt and ask, "Is it Li Shouwen?" No matter what, Li Shouwen had pursued Lin Xian for a long time. In addition, Wang Lu had been playing matchmaker and constantly put in good words for him in front of Lin Xian. So, If this lucky guy was Li Shouwen, Chun she would not be surprised at all. However, what Chun she did not expect was, when he mentioned Li Shouwen's name, Lin Xian still shook her head and replied calmly, "You don't know him either." "Oh, okay." Chun she nodded, then sat on the side and didn't say anything. In fact, after hearing the news that Lin Xian was going to get engaged, Chun she was also happy for Lin Xian from the bottom of his heart. After all, Lin Xian was not young anymore. It was hard enough for her to work alone in Zhonghai for so many years. If she could find someone to rely on, it would be a good thing for her. As for Lin Xian's little thoughts, it was obviously impossible for Chun she not to know. It was just that this kind of thing felt a little awkward just thinking about it, so he could only pretend to be confused. Qin Ruoying did not know the little secret in Lin Xian's heart, so she continued to ask curiously, "You're going to get engaged. How long have you been together?" "It's been almost 4 months." "What? Only 4 months?" Qin Ruoying was truly shocked by Lin Xian's words. Based on her understanding of Lin Xian should be very cautious when it came to relationships, so she really couldn't imagine how outstanding that man was to be able to get Lin Xian to the point where they were talking about marriage in just a few months. "Xian, marriage is not child's play. You've only known each other for a few months, and you're already engaged. What's the difference between this and a flash marriage? Wasn't the most common ending of a flash marriage a flash divorce? Especially for women, if they were so careless about marriage, they would be completely irresponsible for their own future." Qin Ruoying wanted to persuade Lin Xian to reconsider. However, Lin Xian seemed to have thought of everything. She smiled and gestured for her not to worry. Then, she said, "Ying, don't worry. I'm not a little girl anymore. Do you think I'll be blinded by love? When I said that I was about to get engaged, there was actually a prerequisite." "What prerequisite?" "He has to pass my strict test." Lin Xian couldn't help but blink playfully. Seeing that Qin Ruoying was still confused, she smiled and explained, "We're classmates. Your daughter is already so old, but I'm still single. How can I not be anxious? How can my family not be anxious? Even if you're anxious, you can't be so careless." Qin Ruoying rolled her eyes at Lin Xian in exasperation. Seeing this, Lin Xian held onto her hand and patiently explained, "Ying, listen to me. Actually, what I mean is that I'm not young anymore. Since I agreed to date someone, it's obvious that I'm aiming for marriage. Grandpa Mao once said that those who don't date for the purpose of marriage are all hooligans. So I have to carefully examine him. If he can successfully pass my examination, then why can't I marry him?" Qin Ruoying was speechless. After hesitating for a long time, she asked with a puzzled expression, Xian, do you love him?" "Love?" Hearing this, Lin Xian couldn't help but chuckle. "Ying, you might not know. How difficult is it to meet someone you like in this world who also likes you? Actually, a lot of people can only choose one of two. You can either choose the one you like or the one who likes you. I think I'm still very rational, so I choose the latter." Saying this, Lin Xian couldn't help but glance at Chun Shi. She seemed to be envious of the relationship between the couple. Seeing that Lin Xian had already said this, Qin Ruoying naturally couldn't say anything else. Therefore, after hesitating for a while, she could only sincerely wish her well. "Okay. Although it's still a little rushed, I believe in your taste, so I wish you happiness in advance. All the best, Xian." "Thank you." Perhaps because this topic was a little heavy, the two quickly changed the topic, and then chatted about everything. Qin Ruoying hadn't talked so much in a long time. After all, she didn't have many friends, and Lin Xian was one of the few that she had left. Therefore, after lunch, Chun Shi's family didn't rush to leave. Instead, they continued to accompany Lin Xian for afternoon tea. In the end, because Lin Xian received a call from her leader, saying that there was an urgent matter that required her to return to the company, Lin Xian could only reluctantly say goodbye to Chun Shi's family. "Sister, goodbye." Lin Xian had just treated the little guy to a lot of desserts, which made the little guy very happy. Therefore, even though Chun Shi had already walked a distance away with her in his arms, the little guy still reluctantly turned back and waved at Lin Xian. "Nian, goodbye. Sister will treat you to good food next time. Come. Moi. Mua. Goodbye, sister. Hearing this, the little guy covered her mouth with both hands, gave Lin Xian a flying kiss, and then obediently returned to Chen Shi's arms. Lin Xian stood by the street until Chen Shi's family got into the car and left. She didn't leave, just like that afternoon last year. It was a beautiful September day, and the pier was quiet. She stood under the palm tree, just like today, watching the car gradually disappear into the distance. When the rolling thunder finally stopped, he whispered in Qin Ruoying's ear, "The tide is rising." To be honest, Shi didn't think that there would be a spirit energy tide in a super first-tier international city like Zhonghai. What was even more surprising was the scale of the spirit energy tide was far greater than the scale caused by the Qinling spirit binding array. The spirit energy contained in it was even denser than the spirit fog in the Saikin Glacier. Therefore, every drop of rain that fell from the sky contained a lot of spiritual qi of heaven and earth. How was this a simple thunderstorm? This was spiritual liquid from the sky. After briefly explaining to Qin Ruoying what a spirit energy tide was, Shi took her back to the living room and then set up a spirit gathering array for her to cultivate. After all, cultivation was a matter of accumulation over a long period of time. Even if this sudden tide of spirit energy couldn't cause Qin Ruoying's realm to advance by leaps and bounds, it could still save her a lot of effort. After all, it was a good thing with no harm. Naturally, she had to cherish this opportunity. The reason why Qin Ruoying wanted to go into the rain just now was that she had succeeded in her cultivation, so she instinctively wanted to go to places with rich spirit energy. She sat cross-legged next to Qin Ruoying until she entered the deepest level of meditation. Then he got up and went to the balcony. The wind and rain were still outside. She stood on the balcony motionlessly, as if he was waiting for something. Sure enough, about an hour later, a deafening clap of thunder rang out from the horizon again. But this time, the instant the thunder rang out, the entire earth seemed to tremble along with it. Chapter 279. Thunder rumbled, and the earth quaked and the mountains shook. Just as the thunder roared, the entire ground shook violently. In just an instant, the pots, bowls, ladles, basins, chandeliers, photo frames, and other small objects in the room began to shake violently. They either fell on the table or fell to the ground, making a series of clanking sounds. An earthquake. Because of the frequent earthquakes in recent years, the people of Wuxia had a much deeper understanding of earthquakes than before. Therefore, the moment the earthquake happened, the entire community seemed to have been awakened from their sleep by the thunder. Countless people screamed, "Earthquake!" as they rushed out of their houses in a panic. There was the sound of dense footsteps in the corridor. Some residents who were taking a shower did not even have time to put on their clothes at this moment. They ran out of their houses wrapped in a bath towel. It was still raining heavily outside, but at this time no one cared so much. The fleeing crowd surged like a flood and rushed madly toward the gate of the community. In less than 2 minutes, the streets outside the community were already densely packed with people, blocking the entire road. According to historical records, there had never been a destructive earthquake of magnitude 4 or above in the history of Zhonghai. This was because Zhonghai was located in the most stable plate position in the entire Wuxia. It was not in the earthquake zone at all, so let alone a destructive earthquake, even a weak earthquake of magnitude 2 or 3 would be difficult to occur. But today, the people of Zhonghai experienced what it felt like to be in the middle of an earthquake. In fact, when the Wenchuan earthquake happened that year, Zhonghai, which was thousands of miles away, also felt it and even caused a big commotion. However, that big earthquake happened more than 2,000 kilometers away in the Chuanyu area after all, so it was far from being as real and exciting as today. Based on the strong tremor just now, this earthquake was at least a magnitude 4.5 or above, reaching at least the level of a medium-strong earthquake. The earthquake didn't last long. It lasted for about 20 seconds. However, it was the short 20 seconds that really made many people feel like they had escaped death. People who had not experienced an earthquake might not be able to imagine what kind of oppressive feeling an earthquake would bring to people. Perhaps it was only when humans faced the wrath of nature that they would realize how insignificant they were. The downpour continued, but none of the people on the streets dared to return to the residential area. Everyone stood pitifully in the rain, looking at each other. That helpless look was as miserable as it could be. But at this moment, another thunderclap exploded in the sky. Rumble! Rumble! Even if each person could only absorb a little with such a large population base, the heaven and earth spirit energy in Zhonghai would naturally become very sparse. In this regard, Zhonghai and Shangjing could not be compared at all. Although the total population of Shangjing was as many as 20 million, Shangjing was the imperial capital of 5 dynasties. The emperors of each dynasty liked to choose Shangjing as their capital. It was precisely because Shangjing itself was a paradise, located at the head of the dragon veins. So no matter how large the population of Shangjing was, Zhonghai still had such rich heaven and earth spirit energy. Therefore, if there was a heaven and earth anomaly in Shangjing, she would not be surprised at all. But the strange thing was that there was no heaven and earth anomaly in Shangjing, but in Zhonghai, a new city that had only been prosperous for 100 or 200 years, there was one. How could this not surprise Shi? As he flew, Shi pondered the question of why there would be a heaven and earth anomaly in Zhonghai. In fact, if you put aside the dragon veins, Zhonghai could really be considered a blessed land. Why? That was because, as a coastal city, Zhonghai rarely had natural disasters such as typhoons, earthquakes, and tsunamis since ancient times. It was close to the river, the sea, and the plains far away from the earthquake zone, and there were multiple island chains in the outer sea to block tsunamis. Such a unique geographical advantage was extremely rare even in the world. Thinking about it carefully, other than the lack of the dragon veins and the sparse spirit energy, Zhonghai seemed to have no shortcomings. But these were only geographical advantages, and had nothing to do with heaven and earth spirit energy or heaven and earth anomalies. The more Shi thought about it, the more confused he became. But at this moment, a flash of inspiration flashed in his mind, and he suddenly thought of a very important question. 5 years ago, wasn't it also during this thunderstorm that he suddenly went from earth to heavenly jade? Thunderstorm? Spirit energy recovery? Heaven and earth anomaly? Heavenly jade world? The moment this question popped up, Shi's figure suddenly stopped in midair. His entire body froze. For a long time, it was not until the sound of thunder sounded again that Shi seemed to be awakened from his sleep by a gong. He could not help but exclaim. Chapter 280. 5 years ago, Shi was just an ordinary person who couldn't be more ordinary. At that time he had dreams, was willing to work hard, and could endure hardships. Although his life was a little shabby, he always thought that he was very happy and would be even happier in the future. Humans would always have hope for the future. Shi always believed in an old saying, knowledge can change fate. But what he didn't expect was that before he could wait for the day when knowledge could change fate, a rainstorm had already changed his fate in advance. If it wasn't for the sudden thunderstorm, what would he be like now? Shi didn't know, and no one could know. His fate was inexplicably changed just like that. Although the process was difficult, the ending seemed to be much better than before. After all, in the past he only knew how to code, but now he could fly and burrow into the ground. Therefore, Shi was really a little curious. Why did this great gift bag of changing fate fall on his head? Although he didn't know if there was a spirit energy tide on that rainstorm 5 years ago. But based on the scale of today's tide, the spirit energy contained in it was actually far from enough to instantly teleport a person from Earth to the heavenly jade world. Therefore, he could conclude that Either the scale of the spirit energy tide 5 years ago was far greater than today, or there were still some unknown large-scale formations or magic treasures hidden in the super first-tier city of Zhonghai, and those formations and magic treasures were all intact legendary existences. In short, no matter what the reason was, the truth behind it was far from what he could pry into with his current strength. It hadn't been long since Chun-Shi returned to Earth, but in this short period of half a year, he had already encountered a series of unimaginable things. And the question that puzzled him the most was, why was it that until today, except for an unknown divine general, he hadn't encountered anyone above the celestial being level? This didn't seem to make sense. Thinking of this, Chun-Shi couldn't help but make a bold guess in his heart. Perhaps Earth was originally a cultivation planet similar to the heavenly jade world? Until one day, due to some unknown reason, the Earth's spirit chi dried up, so the Earth was completely reduced to a Vipralopa planet? For immortal cultivators, the planet of the last days was like an uninhabitable desert. Therefore, at this time, leaving Earth was obviously their only choice. The immortal cultivators on Earth had left, and the inheritances they left behind could not be cultivated at all because of the sparse spiritual energy. Therefore, they were gradually reconstructed and simplified, turning into a series of inheritances like necromancers, warriors, onmyoji, and so on. Chun-Shi stroked his chin, faintly feeling that his guess might be somewhat close to the truth. It was probably because of the existence of high-level immortal cultivators on Earth that the Siakin Glacier had such a mysterious palace that could affect the flow of time. Chun-Shi had already tasted the benefits of the Great Hall. Now that he suddenly realized that there might also be something of the same level as the Great Hall in Zhonghai, Chun-Shi couldn't help but feel a little moved. The reason why he hadn't taken the initiative to search for them before was mainly because his soul had yet to recover from its injuries at that time. Without his divine sense, he couldn't just wander around this huge city by relying on his eyes alone. Could he? Today, coincidentally, the spirit chi tide had appeared again. Perhaps he could take this opportunity to find the thing that had sent him to heavenly spiral from the surging spirit chi of heaven and earth. Chun-Shi seriously pondered for a while in the sky. Then, as if he had made a decision, he directly flew towards the seaside. The reason why he wanted to go to the seaside was because the spirit chi on the seaside was much denser than in the city. It was obviously somewhat abnormal. Chun-Shi quickly arrived at the seaside. However, before he had time to see the situation on the sea clearly, the sound of waves rumbled into his ears one after another. At this moment, the sky was already dark. Coupled with the dark clouds and torrential rain, there was not a single bit of light on the sea. Seeing this, Chun-Shi immediately lit up a ball of light and threw it out. Only then did he finally see the situation on the sea clearly. He saw that the waves, which were more than 10 meters tall, were raised high like a wall of water. Then they heavily slammed onto the shore. The waves came one after another, and the sound of waves crashing onto the shore came one after another. That majestic scene could be described as rapid waves rise to the sky, raging waves roll to the ground. The majestic sound was like thunder, and the surging waves were like rolling snow. Fortunately, the torrential rain had driven away the tourists by the seaside. Otherwise, with the waves, which were more than 10 meters tall, coming wave after wave, who knew how many people would die on the spot? Looking at the situation, it seemed like there was a tsunami. However, from a scientific point of view, it was basically impossible for a tsunami to occur in Zhonghai. If there was a tsunami in Zhonghai, then the island country and the Gulf Coast in front of it would have become an underwater world by now. However, there was even an earthquake in Zhonghai today. What was so strange about a tsunami? Chun-Shi didn't stay at the seaside for too long. After briefly checking the situation along the coast, he directly flew towards the depths of the sea. The spirit chi of heaven and earth was getting denser and denser. Could it be? This time, the heaven and earth phenomenon really appeared on the sea. Chun-Shi frowned and looked at the sea surface as he continued to fly forward. After flying for about another 2 minutes, he finally arrived at the place where the spirit energy was the most concentrated. This location was no longer in Wuxia, but in the international waters of the Pacific Ocean. If he continued to fly forward, it wouldn't take long for him to reach Japan's territory. It was worth noting that even though Chun-Shi had flown so far, he still hadn't flown out of the range of the thunderstorm. From this, it could be seen how huge the scale of this thunderstorm was. Chun-Shi lit up another light ball. After looking around the surrounding environment, he descended to a height of about 10 meters above the sea surface. The sea surface below was very calm, and the slightly rippling sea surface seemed to be silently telling him, "There's nothing here." However, Chun-Shi wasn't stupid. The coastal area had surging waves and raging waves crashing onto the shore, but here, the sea was calm and the waves were vast. Wasn't this strange enough? After seeing the heaven and earth phenomenon in the Saikin Glacier, he was already mentally prepared. Although he didn't know why there was no spirit fog here, in terms of the concentration of spirit energy, this place was not inferior to the Saikin Glacier at all. Therefore, Chun-Shi could conclude that the heaven and earth phenomenon would definitely appear here. After confirming that there was nothing strange at the bottom of the sea, Chun-Shi simply sat cross-legged on the sea surface, cultivating while silently waiting for the heaven and earth phenomenon to appear. After about an hour, he suddenly opened his eyes. There was finally movement on the sea surface. Chun-Shi placed the light ball not far above the sea surface. Through the light emitted by the light ball, he could clearly see that a whirlpool suddenly appeared on the sea surface. The whirlpool was very small at first, and it looked like the whirlpool caused by a swimming pool when water was released. Its diameter was only about 50 centimeters. However, as time passed, the whirlpool began to expand rapidly at a speed visible to the naked eye. About 5 minutes later, a bolt of lightning struck down from the sky and directly hit the center of the whirlpool. Immediately after, a cyclone slowly rose from the sea. As the cyclone became thicker and thicker, it also rose higher and higher. After a while, a waterspout rose from the sea just like that. Like the legendary pillar that supported the sky, this waterspout that suddenly rose from the ground actually went straight to the sky and was tightly connected with the thunderclouds in the sky. Boom! Accompanied by the sound of thunder, another bolt of lightning struck down from the sky and directly hit the waterspout that had just risen. The sky suddenly brightened, and countless snake-shaped lightning bolts shuttled back and forth in the waterspout. It looked particularly shocking. Chun-Shi finally understood. The whirlpool absorbed the spirit chi of heaven and earth. When the spirit chi accumulated to a certain extent, it would cause a waterspout. However, because he had swallowed most of the spirit chi, it took more than half an hour for the waterspout to condense and form. Well, it's better to wait and see what will happen today. Chun-Shi retreated a few hundred meters, temporarily distancing himself from the waterspout, ready to see what else would appear. However, at this moment, suddenly, a rumbling sound came from the sky. It was not thunder, but the sound of a plane. Chun-Shi looked up and saw a transport plane rushing out of the clouds in the distance. Then, the transport plane flew straight towards the waterspout in the heavy rain. This kind of thunderstorm weather was not conducive to flying, and coupled with the strong airflow near the waterspout, the transport plane did not dare to approach at all. Therefore, the transport plane glided in the air for a while before opening the cargo door, dropping something and turning around to leave. Chun-Shi looked carefully and found that the small black dot dropped by the transport plane from a height of thousands of meters was not cargo at all, but a Chapter 282. Person. Just like an airdrop, he was directly dropped from the sky by a transport plane. With the help of a flash of lightning, Chun-Shi could clearly see that the person was only wearing a black combat suit. He didn't wear a parachute or a flight suit. After being dropped by the transport plane, the person spread out his hands and did a free fall in the sky. The height of the cumulonimbus cloud was generally between 600 and 2,000 meters. Tonight's thunderclouds gave people a strong sense of oppression, so it could be speculated that the height of the clouds tonight should be about 1,000 meters. 1,000 meters was actually not that high. It would take less than 15 seconds for an object to fall from a height of 1,000 meters. It was a short time, but the falling speed was very fast. When an object fell from a high altitude, due to the acceleration of gravity, the falling speed would become faster and faster. In contrast, the object would be subjected to greater and greater air resistance. When the air resistance reached a certain level, the air resistance would balance with gravity, causing the object to begin to move at a uniform speed. This speed was also called the ultimate speed or the finishing speed. Assuming that this person weighed 60 kilograms, then through the formula V equals, this person's ultimate speed would be 617 kilometers per hour. Falling into the sea at such a speed was no different from falling on a steel plate. With a smack sound, the person would probably be like a cake falling to the ground, instantly turning into a pool of paste. Of course, the above was only a hypothesis from a scientific point of view. Obviously, this outsider in front of him could not be judged by common sense. Sure enough, when the person fell into the sea, after the huge impact was offset by the seawater, he immediately got out of the sea as if nothing had happened. Then, he stepped on the stormy waves and went straight in the direction of Chunxi. He was indeed running. In ancient times, there was a dharma crossing the river with a reed, but this person did not even use a reed. He just stepped on the waves and ran directly. This directly showed that he had broken through the limits of the human body and stood at the peak of martial arts. And this was the so-called celestial. Chunxi floated in the air more than 10 meters above the sea and quietly watched the person running towards him. It was a man who looked about 30 years old. Although he was wearing a combat suit, he did not have any badge to prove his identity. This was not Wuxia's territory, but a public area in the world. According to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, any country had the right to interrogate and search stateless people and ships on the high seas. Therefore, this kind of behavior that did not even reveal his identity was actually very eye-catching. However, looking at his face, this man should be Wuxia's person. Chapter 283. After hearing Ijiro's greeting, Chunxi didn't respond to him. After all, as a Wuxia man, he would always feel some hostility towards a strange Japanese. In contrast, the Wuxia man in front of him was obviously easier to get Chunxi's approval. Therefore, after looking around, Chunxi focused his attention on the Wuxia man in front of him. Then he sat cross-legged in the air, lowered his head and said to him, "Look, they even brought a warship here. But you're all alone. Don't you think it's a bit too shabby?" Hearing this, the man shook his head and smiled bitterly. His name was Qin Shui, one of the main people in charge of the Wu Lian branch in Zhonghai, in charge of intelligence. Qin Shui had just stepped into the diviner stage, so his realm was not very stable, so his rating in the Wu Lian was only S-. The reason why he came here alone was because this was not a mission issued by the Wu Lian, but his own personal action. Tonight, there were all kinds of almost impossible natural disasters in Zhonghai, so the Wu Lian branch of Zhonghai naturally had to be dispatched to prevent any uncontrollable accidents. Qin Shui originally had a mission, but as the only diviner in the Zhonghai branch, he was keenly aware of a huge amount of energy at sea, so he mobilized a transport plane to send him here to check the situation. But what Qin Shui didn't expect was that when he arrived at the destination, he saw a person here. When Chunxi's family traveled, they never deliberately hid their identity. So Qin Shui always knew that Chunxi was in Zhonghai. Therefore, when he first saw the figure, Qin Shui subconsciously thought that this person should be Chunxi. So he changed his original plan and directly jumped out of the plane. The result was as he expected. The person in front of him was indeed Chunxi. Everyone in the Wu Lian branch knew about the new EX level existence. Qin Shui made a simple self-introduction, after which Chunxi nodded slightly and then asked, "Can you fly?" Chunxi was about 10 meters above the sea, about 3 or 4 stories high, so Qin Shui could only slightly raise his head when talking to him. After hearing Chunxi's words, Qin Shui was stunned for a moment. Then he replied with a troubled expression, "Yes, but not for too long." As far as Qin Shui knew, if it wasn't necessary, he would never fly. After all, for a martial artist, this kind of meaningless consumption was actually the same as an athlete who had to play a game the next day. Oh, okay. After hearing Qin Shuai's words, Chen Shi gently waved his hand. Immediately after, a gentle force surrounded Qin Shuai. Qin Shuai's body suddenly. Because he knew that Chen Shi wouldn't attack him for no reason, he didn't resist too fiercely. So, he just stared blankly as Chen Shi lifted him into the air. This action, of course. This action, assessed. This. They didn't seem to hate the United States who dropped the atomic bomb. Instead, they felt that the United States was the savior of Japan. Many fanatics even praised the United States with gratitude. Therefore, Ijiro Saito was very humble in front of the people of the United States. But what Ijiro Saito didn't expect was that his humility lowered his evaluation in the hearts of the people of the United States, and even affected the credibility of Inyang Liao's strength evaluation. As time went by, the waterspout did not become smaller, but thicker and thicker. About half an hour later, the energy contained in the waterspout seemed to have reached its limit. Suddenly, a bolt of lightning struck the waterspout. The waterspout immediately became like an electrified light tube, and light blue snake-shaped electric arcs flashed wildly in it. A huge amount of energy filled it, and the waterspout suddenly expanded more than 10 meters outward at a speed visible to the naked eye. It looked like it was about to explode. Qin Shuai opened his eyes and looked at the scene in front of him. Before he could recover, he was pulled back by Chen Shi and instantly retreated hundreds of meters away. At this time, the waterspout also began to shake violently. Qin Shuai had never seen such a scene, so he couldn't help but ask, "This? What's going on?" However, before Chen Shi could answer his question, the waterspout in front of him suddenly changed again. The originally thick waterspout suddenly separated from the sky and became two in an instant. The two waterspouts rotated and intersected, spiraling straight into the sky, and their shape looked somewhat similar to a fried dough twist. Chen Shi frowned slightly, because he suddenly found that all the surrounding spiritual energy was madly rushing towards the center of the two waterspouts. And with the continuous influx of spiritual energy, a bright light suddenly appeared in a position in the middle of the two waterspouts. The light was white, and at first it was only the size of a star. But after a few breaths, the light suddenly burst into an extremely dazzling light. Like the rising sun, it instantly dispelled all the haze between heaven and earth. Such a dazzling light suddenly made Qin Shuai couldn't help but close his eyes and slightly tilt his head, not daring to look at it again. But Chen Shi didn't seem to be affected at all. She raised her head slightly and calmly looked at the source of the light. Finally, you're tuning in to the Legend of the Vagabond YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.